Imagine a desert. Not the desert of popular imagination, not the rolling golden dunes of movie screens, endlessly photogenic, endlessly empty. This is a harder desert, a more ancient one, a desert of red and ochre stone, of cliffs that rise sheer from the valley floor in walls of carved wind and deep time, of narrow gorges where the sun reaches the ground for only an hour each day, of vast open plateau where the rock lies cracked and fractured and coloured, rose and amber and violet and the deep rust of ancient iron, in shades that have no name in any language, because they were never painted by any painter before nature painted them here, over hundreds of millions of years, in colours that seem to come not from the surface of the world, but from somewhere deep inside it. This is the Negev. This is the Hejaz. This is the ancient land of Edom and the margins of the Sinai, the place where the great deserts of Arabia begin to press against the hills of what is now southern Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia and the southern edge of Israel and Palestine. It is a place of savage beauty and savage heat, where the temperature can crack 50 degrees Celsius in the summer shade, where rainfall is measured in single-digit centimeters per year, where the rock is the only constant and the water is a rumor and the shade is a gift. And yet, rising from the floor of a hidden valley, carved into the living rock of a sandstone cliff 300 meters high, there is a facade. It is enormous, 40 meters wide, 28 meters tall, carved so precisely into the rose-red rock that the columns and the pediment and the ornamental urns look, from a distance, as if they were built rather than excavated, as if some great builder had set stone upon stone here, rather than taken the stone away. The detail is extraordinary. The engaged columns with their Nabataean capitals, the figures in the half-pediments, the broken gable at the top, the whole composition drawing the eye upward to a great urn at the summit, that local Bedouin once believed held the treasure of a pharaoh and shot at with their rifles for generations trying to break it open. The facade faces east, so that in the early morning the rising sun strikes it and the rock blazes, all the reds and pinks and ambers of the sandstone coming alive in the first light, as if the cliff itself were on fire. The Bedouin who guarded this valley through the long centuries when it was lost to the world beyond its desert called it the Khazneh, the Treasury, and the city that surrounds it, carved into the cliffs and built in the canyon and grown across the valley floor over 5 centuries of extraordinary history, is called Petra. The Greeks called it the Rock. The Nabataeans, the people who built it, carved it, lived in it, made it the capital of a desert kingdom that stretched from the Hejaz to the Hauran, from the Sinai to the Negev, from the shores of the Red Sea to the edges of the Mediterranean world. The Nabataeans called it, simply, Rakmu. It is one of the most breathtaking places on earth, and the people who made it are one of the most fascinating, most mysterious, most underestimated civilizations in the whole history of the ancient world. Tonight, we are going to tell their story, the whole story, from the very beginning, from the nameless nomads of the deep Arabian desert who first wandered into the history books in the 4th century before our era, through the long brilliant centuries of the desert kingdom, through the extraordinary trading empire that made a handful of nomadic tribesmen into the masters of the ancient spice routes and the richest middlemen in the ancient world, through the carved city, the rock-cut temples and tombs and triclinia, the remarkable water systems that made life possible in a land that seemed to forbid it, through the Nabataean alphabet that would eventually give birth to the Arabic script, still written by hundreds of millions of people today, through the great queens and kings, Aretas and Obodas and Malchus and the remarkable Shakilat, who played the great powers of the ancient world, Rome and Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, against each other with a diplomatic skill that preserved their kingdom's independence for centuries, through the strange and still debated moment of annexation, when the Roman Emperor Trajan absorbed the Nabataean kingdom into his empire in 106 of the Common Era, and the Nabataeans became Romans, and the trading caravans that had made them rich slowly found new routes, and the great carved city in the desert slowly, quietly emptied out, and the Bedouin came back, and the centuries closed over it like sand over a buried thing, and then the centuries of forgetting, longer than the Nabataean kingdom itself, until a young Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt disguised himself as an Arab pilgrim and slipped past the Bedouin guards in 1812 and walked through the narrow gorge called the Sick and came out the other side into the valley and saw the treasury blazing in the morning sun and brought Petra back to the world. But before we begin, before we go back through 2,000 years to the desert and the caravans and the rose-red city, I want to invite you to do something. Let your body become heavy, however you are arranged right now, lying down, settled, the day's weight still on you. Let that weight increase. Let gravity do its work. The muscles of your shoulders, your back, your legs, you have held them long enough. Let them soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open. Breathe, and as you breathe out, let a little more tension leave with the air. You are going somewhere tonight, not far in distance. You will stay exactly where you are, but very far in time and very far in spirit, to a place where the rock burns with color and the air smells of frankincense and the stars over the desert are so thick and so bright that they seem to be within reach of an outstretched hand. The Nabataeans were a desert people, and the desert has a particular quality of stillness that I want you to carry with you as we go. The desert empties the mind. The desert removes the unnecessary. In the desert, at night, there is nothing to hear but the wind, and nothing to see but the stars, and nothing to feel but the rock cooling beneath you, as the heat stored all day bleeds away into the dark sky above, and the whole enormous fact of the universe presses down on you, with a particular kind of clarity that can only come in empty places. The Nabataeans knew this clarity. They lived in it. They built their civilization inside it. So breathe slowly. Settle deeper. Tell me where you are tonight. Is it warm where you are, or cold? Can you hear wind? Can you see stars? Leave a comment below, because somewhere in the world right now, in a dozen different countries, under a dozen different skies, other people are doing exactly what you are doing, lying in the dark, listening, letting a story carry them. We are doing what human beings have always done, on every continent, in every age, gathering in the dark to hear about people who are gone. We are going to the desert, back through the centuries, back through the forgetting, back to the valley in the red rock and the people who carved their whole world out of stone. This is the story of the Nabataeans. The story of the Nabataeans begins in obscurity, as so many of the great stories of the ancient world begin. Not with a grand founding moment, not with a legendary king or a divine intervention, but with a people doing what people have always done in difficult places, surviving, adapting, making do, being clever about it. The Arabian Peninsula, in the centuries before our era, was not the empty wasteland that the word desert might suggest. It was a world, a difficult, demanding, specific world, with its own geography of possible and impossible, its own seasonal rhythms, its own routes and resources and opportunities, its own web of tribes and alliances and rivalries that were ancient long before any outsider arrived to record them. And through this world, across the vast, sandy and rocky expanses that outsiders called uninhabitable and insiders called home, there had moved, for uncounted centuries, the nomads. The ancient nomads of Arabia are shadowy figures in the historical record, because they did not write about themselves, and because the settled people who did write about them mostly regarded them with a mixture of condescension and unease. Barbarians, robbers, wanderers, people without houses or cities, or the marks of civilization. The Greeks had a word for people who moved with their herds and lived in tents. They called them skinny tie, tent dwellers. The Egyptians and the Mesopotamians before them had similar contempts for the wanderers on their margins, people who refused to settle down, who lived outside the orderly world of walls and fields and records. But the nomads knew something that the settled peoples did not. They knew the desert. They knew where the water was hidden, which dry valleys held springs that flowed only in the wet season, which rock faces collected enough dew in the cold mornings to fill a cup, which distant waterholes could be reached in the span of a hard journey if you knew the route. They knew the seasonal pastures, where the sparse desert scrub grew thick enough in the brief spring to feed a flock, where the wadis flooded after the rare rain and left behind a fleeting abundance of green. They knew the routes between the oases that dotted the peninsula like islands in a stone sea, and they knew the timing, when to move, when to rest, when the heat made travel impossible, and when the cool of night made it the only time. This knowledge was their capital. It was passed down in stories and songs and the practiced silence of experienced guides. It was worth more, in the desert, than any city's walls, and it would, in time, make them very rich. The earliest mention of the people called Nabataeans in any surviving ancient source comes in a document from the age of Alexander the Great, the last decades of the 4th century before the Common Era. The context is military, and the tone is not flattering. A Greek general named Antigonus, one of the successors fighting over the fragments of Alexander's empire, sent an expedition into the desert to find, and if possible subdue these people who were, apparently, beginning to make a nuisance of themselves around the edges of the settled world. The expedition found the Nabataeans on a rocky height, a natural fortress, perhaps the Rock of Petra, though the identification is not certain, and came back with a report that these were desert nomads, tent dwellers, people who drank nothing but water and ate nothing but meat and honey and grain, who kept no wine and built no houses and planted no fields, and who were extremely hostile to any attempt to pin them down. What the Greek expedition had stumbled upon, without quite realizing it, was not a backward desert tribe, but the beginning of something remarkable. The Nabataeans were not simply nomads, or if they were nomads of a particular and commercially shrewd kind. They were positioned at the crossroads of one of the most important and most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world, and they had understood, earlier than anyone else, the extraordinary opportunity this represented. Let me explain what that trade route was, because it is the key to everything. The ancient world, the Mediterranean world of Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, the world of the Fertile Crescent and Persia and Mesopotamia, ran on incense. This is a fact that is easy to underestimate from our own vantage point, but it was simply the reality of ancient life. From the grandest temple to the humblest household sacrifice, the gods demanded incense. The temples of every cult in the ancient world burned incense in enormous quantities, not as an ornament or a luxury, but as a necessity. The sacred smoke was the offering, the means by which the prayers of the worshippers rose to the divine. Every sacrifice, every ritual, every prayer offered at any altar in the ancient world was accompanied by incense. The Roman Empire, at its height, burned hundreds of tons of incense every year. Egypt, in its centuries of temple worship, must have burned as much. And the Greek world, and Persia, and the Levant, and every kingdom and city-state between the Mediterranean and the Indus, all of them burned incense, and all of them needed more. The incense that the ancient world demanded came from one place. The frankincense trees, Boswellia sacra, and its relatives, grow in a narrow strip of territory in the southern Arabian Peninsula, in what is now Yemen and Oman, and in the neighboring mountains of Somalia across the Red Sea. They grow nowhere else in the world in commercial quantities, because they require the specific combination of a monsoon-influenced climate and a rocky, well-drained limestone soil that is found only in this narrow arc. To tap a frankincense tree for its resin, the white teardrop-shaped drops of aromatic gum that harden in the air and burn with the distinctive sacred smoke, you cut the bark and let the resin bleed out and collect and harden. The trees live for centuries, and the resin they produce was, for thousands of years, one of the most valuable substances in the world, worth its weight in silver, transported across the world by a system of trade that was already ancient when the Nabataeans entered it. The Great Incense Road, the frankincense route, ran from the frankincense-producing region of southern Arabia northward through the Hejaz, the long strip of western Arabia between the mountains and the Red Sea, a journey of some 2,400 kilometers through a series of oasis towns that provided water and shelter and the chance to exchange and resupply. From the Hejaz the road branched, west toward Egypt and the Mediterranean, north toward the Fertile Crescent and Persia, northwest toward the Negev and Sinai, and onward to Gaza and the ports of the Mediterranean coast. The caravans that traveled this road were enormous by ancient standards. Pliny the Elder, the Roman writer, described caravans of thousands of camels, the great column of animals and men and goods moving through the desert silence, carrying the wealth of Arabia toward the waiting markets of the ancient world. And the Nabataeans, in the centuries before our era, had positioned themselves to control the northern end of this route. Their territory, the desert of the Negev and the rocky land of ancient Edom, sat directly across the final stretches of the road before it reached the Mediterranean markets. Any caravan moving frankincense from Arabia to Egypt or to the Levant had to pass through Nabataean country. The Nabataeans collected tolls. They provided water and guides and protection, and eventually, and most importantly, they provided a city, a great trading city carved into the rock of a hidden valley, a city where the caravans could rest and the goods could be stored and weighed and taxed and traded, a city that was at once a commercial hub and a religious center and the capital of an emerging kingdom. That city was Petra. But before there was a city, there were the desert routes, and before the routes were dominated by the Nabataeans, there was a long period, invisible to us in any surviving records, during which the Nabataeans were learning their trade, learning the desert, learning the art of water in a waterless land, learning the peculiar diplomatic skills that would let them survive between the great powers, and learning, slowly, the habits and the institutions of a settled people, without ever quite abandoning the desert culture from which they had come. The Antigonus episode of the 310s BCE gives us our first glimpse of them. The Greek account describes them as nomadic, fierce, and surprisingly clever. When the Greek army came to attack them, the Nabataeans dispersed, left their rock, scattered into the desert with their flocks and their families, made themselves impossible to pin down. They wrote a letter to Antigonus, which is itself remarkable, suggesting literacy, or at least access to literate intermediaries, explaining, in politely worded terms, why he should leave them alone. They were not hostile to his interests, they said. They were desert people, and the Greeks had nothing to gain from fighting them in the desert, where the Greeks were at every disadvantage. A pragmatic argument, coolly made. Antigonus, having lost one expedition to the desert and the Nabataean evasiveness, decided they were probably right, and let them be. It is the first recorded Nabataean diplomatic maneuver, and it is already characteristically shrewd. The Nabataeans would prove themselves, over the following 3 centuries, to be among the most skilled diplomatic operators in the ancient world, a small desert people surrounded by empires who survived and flourished, not by matching the great powers militarily, but by being useful to them, elusive when threatened, cooperative when threatened more, and always pragmatic. They rarely sought confrontation. They preferred negotiation. They were willing to pay tribute when tribute was the cost of peace, and willing to fight, fiercely and effectively, when fight they must. But their preference was always for the deal, the arrangement, the understanding that left both sides with something, and cost less than blood. This was a desert people's pragmatism, born of a world where the resources were too scarce for unnecessary waste. The great story of Nabataean history, the story that explains everything that follows, is the story of the transition from nomadic tent dwellers, from the desert people described with mild contempt by Greek observers in the 4th century, to the settled, sophisticated, architecturally extraordinary, commercially dominant people who built Petra and ruled the incense routes and minted their own coins and negotiated with Rome as near equals and left behind one of the most remarkable cities in human history. This transition was not sudden. It took at least 2 centuries, from roughly 300 to roughly 100 BCE, and it was driven by the extraordinary commercial success that came from controlling the frankincense trade. The Nabataeans, as they grew rich, also grew settled, and as they grew settled, they grew, in the ancient sense of the word, civilized. But they never entirely lost the desert, and this, the combination of desert pragmatism and commercial sophistication, of nomadic roots and urban ambition, is what makes the Nabataeans so interesting. They were not like the Romans or the Egyptians or the Greeks, who had been urban for so long that the city was simply the natural condition of human life. The Nabataeans remembered the desert. Their gods had desert names. Their dead were buried in rock, not in stone sarcophagi. Their water systems were built by people who understood, at a cellular level, what water meant in a land without it. Their architecture, those famous carved facades, was something utterly their own. Neither Greek, nor Egyptian, nor Mesopotamian, but a synthesis, a hybrid, a thing that could only have been made by people who looked at the world from the particular vantage point of the rose-red cliffs of Edom and decided to make something no one had ever made before. Let us go and see what they made, to understand why Petra rose where it did. Why, in the middle of an apparently barren desert, one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world was built and flourished for 500 years. You need to understand frankincense, not just the substance itself, though we will return to that. You need to understand the economics, the logistics, the geography of the ancient trade that moved frankincense from the trees of southern Arabia to the temples and altars of the entire known world. You need to understand the caravans, settle deeper as I describe this, because the caravan is one of the great images of the ancient world, and it deserves to be held in the imagination. Close your eyes for a moment and see it. Not the romantic version of the movie screen, not the single line of photogenic camels against a perfect sunset, but the real thing, enormous and slow and full of sound and smell, the great commercial artery of the ancient trade routes alive and moving. A caravan in the height of the Nabataean trading era might contain hundreds of camels, sometimes, according to ancient sources, thousands. The camels moved in a long column, swaying under their enormous loads, making the deep gurgling complaint that camels make, filling the desert air with the sound and the smell of loaded animals on the march. Each camel carried a load of perhaps 250 kilograms. carefully balanced panniers of goods, sacks of frankincense, wrapped in canvas or leather, to protect the precious resin from the heat, jars of myrrh, the other great Arabian aromatic, bolts of silk from China or India, spices, cinnamon, cassia, pepper, cardamom from the east, precious stones, copper ingots, ivory. The caravan was the ancient world's supply chain, moving the goods of one end of the known world to the other, covering ground so slowly, 25 to 30 kilometers on a good day, that a journey from the frankincense-producing regions of southern Arabia to the Mediterranean coast might take 60 to 70 days, 2 months of slow desert travel, before the goods could be loaded onto ships and dispersed to their final markets. The camels made this possible. The Bactrian camel of Central Asia and the dromedary of Arabia are among the most extraordinary biological adaptations on the planet, and the ancient world ran on them. A dromedary, the one-humped camel of Arabia, can carry 250 kilograms across 50 kilometers of desert without drinking, can survive for a week or more without water in cool conditions, can lose 25% of its body weight in water, and still function where a horse would be dead. It can eat the thorny shrubs that nothing else will touch. It navigates soft sand and rocky terrain with equal ease. It provides milk that is more nutritious and more drought-resistant than any other domestic animal's milk. The hump, which is not water but fat, a stored reserve of energy, gives it the desert endurance that no other pack animal can match. Without the camel, the incense trade could not have existed. The water sources between southern Arabia and the Mediterranean were too sparse, the distances too great, the heat too killing. The camel made the desert crossable, and the crossing of the desert was what made the Nabataeans rich. They understood this better than anyone. In a period when the camel was still a relatively novel beast of burden for long-distance trade, the great camel caravans were a development of the first millennium BCE, not before. The Nabataeans were among the earliest and most sophisticated managers of the caravan routes. They knew where the water was. They controlled the wells. They knew which routes were safe in which seasons, which oases were reliable, and which dried up in drought years, which passes through the mountains were passable, and which were death traps. And they charged for this knowledge, in tolls, in fees for guides and protection, in the tax on goods that moved through their territory. The goods that moved were extraordinary in their variety and their origin. The ancient incense road carried not only the frankincense and myrrh that gave it its name, but a whole world of trade goods, from the east, from India and China by sea, to the ports of the Arabian Gulf and the Red Sea. Then overland came silk, cotton, spices, precious stones, indigo, ivory. From Arabia itself came incense, aromatics, fine horses. Arabian horses were already famous in antiquity for their speed and endurance, pearls from the Arabian Gulf, and a variety of desert products. From the west and north came the manufactured goods of the Mediterranean world, fine pottery, glass, wine, olive oil, metalwork, papyrus, grain. The caravans moved in both directions, carrying different goods each way, and at every point of exchange, every oasis, every caravanserai, every city along the route, the traders who facilitated the exchange took their cut. The Nabataeans took a very large cut. Their territory at its greatest extent commanded not just Petra and the immediate surrounds, but the entire northern section of the Incense Road, through the Negev and the Hejaz, and much of the Sinai, and the land on both sides of the Gulf of Aqaba. They had ports, Isla, the modern Aqaba, on the Red Sea, Rhinocolora and Gaza on the Mediterranean, through which the seaborne trade also passed. They could tax both the overland caravans and the maritime traffic, and they could charge what they liked, because no one could bypass them. The geography funneled the trade through Nabataean territory, whether the traders wanted to pay the tolls or not. Ancient sources give us some sense of the scale of the profits. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, calculated that the Roman Empire spent on incense and other aromatics from Arabia and India the equivalent of around 100 million sesterces every year, an almost incomprehensible sum, the equivalent of perhaps 10 or 15% of the entire Roman state budget. Of this enormous flow of wealth, a significant fraction passed through Nabataean hands. The traders of the ancient world did not record their margins in terms we can easily translate, but the city of Petra, its scale, its extraordinary architecture, its evidence of luxury and surplus, gives us a sense of what the incense trade meant to the Nabataeans. They were very, very rich. But wealth alone does not explain Petra. Wealth explains the resources available to build it. What explains Petra? What explains its location, its layout, its particular genius, is water. Because the essential problem of a city in the desert, any desert city, but this desert above all, is not the heat, or the sand, or the distance from other places. The essential problem is water. Without water, nothing lives, nothing grows, nothing can be maintained, no population can be sustained, no city can exist. And the valley of Petra, red and beautiful and enclosed, received on average perhaps 150 millimeters of rain per year, less than half the minimum considered necessary for rain-fed agriculture, less than many deserts, delivered mostly in 2 or 3 violent winter storms, and then almost nothing for the remaining 10 months. The Nabataeans solved this problem so brilliantly that Petra, at its height, may have supported a population of 30,000 people or more in one of the driest regions in the ancient world. They did it through one of the most sophisticated pre-industrial water management systems ever devised. A system so carefully engineered to the specific geography of the Petra Valley, so cleverly designed to capture every drop of rainfall and direct it to where it was needed and store it against the months of dryness, that scholars and engineers studying it today are still finding things to admire. But let me not get ahead of the story. Before we stand inside the carved city and look up at the facades and understand the water systems, we need to watch the city grow, to follow the Nabataeans through the crucial centuries when they transformed themselves from nomads into city builders. And that means we need to meet their kings, the Nabataean kingdom, an official, organized monarchy with a royal line, a capital, a bureaucracy, coinage, and the other trappings of settled power, appears to have taken its definitive form sometime in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The earlier Nabataeans of the 4th and 3rd centuries were already important commercial players, already controlling the caravan routes, already wealthy, but the full apparatus of a desert kingdom, the king with his court and his ministers, his army and his diplomats and his inscriptions in stone. These belong to the period beginning around 1608 BCE, when a king named Aretas III appears in the historical record, and the Nabataean dynasty is properly underway. The name Aretas, or, in its Nabataean form, Aretat, is the one that recurs most often in the royal line, and we will return to several of its bearers. But let us begin with the world that the early Nabataean kings navigated, because it was a world of extraordinary complexity and danger, and the survival of the small desert kingdom through centuries of great power competition is one of the remarkable political stories of the ancient world, the Hellenistic world. The world that Alexander the Great's conquests had created was, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE, a world of competing successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies of Egypt, wealthy and sophisticated, controlling the Nile Delta and the trade of the eastern Mediterranean, the Seleucids of Syria and Mesopotamia, heirs to the largest fragment of Alexander's empire, always overstretched, always fighting on too many fronts, and a constellation of smaller kingdoms and city-states in between, jockeying for position, making alliances and breaking them, surviving as best they could. Nabataean territory sat in a particularly awkward position, between the Ptolemaic sphere in Egypt and the Sinai and the Seleucid sphere in Syria and the Levant. Both great powers wanted influence over the caravan routes. Both would have been delighted to absorb the Nabataean kingdom and its revenues directly, and both had the military capacity, in theory, to do exactly that. The fact that neither did, that the Nabataean kingdom maintained its independence throughout the entire Hellenistic period, never becoming a province of either Ptolemaic Egypt or the Seleucid Empire, never losing its essential political freedom despite constant pressure and occasional military adventures by both, is a tribute to Nabataean diplomatic skill of the highest order. How did they manage it? Through a combination of tactics that would become characteristic of Nabataean foreign policy for the next 3 centuries. First, they were useful. A Nabataean kingdom that controlled the caravan routes and paid regular tribute was worth more to the great powers than a conquered province that had to be pacified and administered at enormous cost. The Nabataeans understood this, and they made themselves useful. As commercial intermediaries, as suppliers of goods, especially the famous Nabataean bitumen from the Dead Sea, which was exported across the ancient world for waterproofing and embalming, as providers of intelligence about what was happening in the desert beyond the cultivated lands. Second, they were elusive. A military campaign against the Nabataeans in their desert homeland was, as Antigonus had discovered, extraordinarily difficult. The desert itself was their best defense. An invading army that outpaced its supply lines in the waterless country died of thirst before it could fight. The Nabataeans had water, their enemies did not. Third, they played both sides. When the Ptolemies and Seleucids were at war, which was frequently, the Nabataeans managed to maintain working relations with whichever side seemed more dangerous at the moment, switching allegiances with a pragmatism that lesser diplomats might have called treachery, and that the Nabataeans called survival. There were moments when this balancing act failed, when the great powers came for them with armies they could not easily elude. The most dramatic such moment occurred around 65 BCE, when the Seleucid kingdom was in its death throes, and a new power was beginning to make itself felt in the region: Rome. The Roman general Pompey, reorganizing the eastern Mediterranean after the collapse of Seleucid power, sent his legate Marcus Aemilius Scaurus to subdue the Nabataeans. Scaurus marched his army into Nabataean territory, but the desert stopped him as efficiently as it had stopped every invader before. His army ran short of supplies, he could not sustain the siege, and the Nabataean king of the moment, Aretas III, who called himself, in a telling piece of self-positioning, Phil Hellene, the Greek lover, advertising his Hellenized sophistication to a world where Greek culture was still the prestige marker, negotiated a settlement. He paid 300 talents of silver. Scaurus marched away. Nabataean independence survived, and Aretas III minted coins celebrating the event. Not the payment of tribute, that would be too embarrassing to commemorate, but his own image, in the Hellenistic royal style, with the profile portrait and the Greek inscription, a king among kings, a civilized monarch of the Mediterranean world. The coins are among our most direct evidence of how the Nabataean kings presented themselves, and they tell an interesting story. By the 1st century BCE, the Nabataean king was presenting himself as a fully Hellenized ruler, culturally fluent in the Greek world's own language of royal legitimacy, while remaining, at the same time, the king of a desert people, with their own distinct culture, religion, and language. This double identity, Nabataean and Hellenistic, desert and Mediterranean, indigenous and cosmopolitan, runs through everything in Petra, and it is one of the things that makes Nabataean civilization so fascinating. They were never entirely one thing. They absorbed influences with a magpie promiscuity: Greek architectural forms, Egyptian decorative motifs, Mesopotamian religious ideas, Roman civic infrastructure, and combined them with their own desert inheritance into something that was recognizably, stubbornly, uniquely themselves. But before we walk through the carved city in full, let us pause to meet one of the most remarkable of all the Nabataean monarchs, the king whose reign coincides with the full flowering of Petra, and whose story is one of the most dramatic in the whole Nabataean record. His name was Aretas IV. He is sometimes called, in modern scholarship, the greatest of the Nabataean kings, and he reigned for a very long time, from 9 BCE to 40 CE, a reign of nearly half a century. Long enough to span the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius in Rome, long enough to see the birth of what would later be called Christianity, long enough to transform Petra into the great city that we know from its ruins. We will return to Aretas IV, but first, we need to walk into the city he built. There is a particular quality to the approach to Petra that no description fully captures, though many people have tried. It begins not with the city itself, but with the walk toward it, a walk that the Nabataeans designed, whether consciously or not, as a kind of preparation, a gradual stripping away of the ordinary world, a slow descent into something else. You enter the Sick. The Sick is the great natural gorge. Technically, a Sick is a natural watercourse carved by flash floods through sandstone that forms the main entrance to the valley of Petra, a narrow crack in the rock that runs for about 1 kilometer and 200 meters from the open desert to the hidden valley. The word means shaft in Arabic, and it is exactly right. The Sick is a shaft driven into the rock, its walls rising to heights of 100 meters and more, the gap between them sometimes only 2 meters wide, so narrow that you walk in perpetual shadow even in full daylight. The sky above you, a ribbon of blue between the looming red walls. The walls themselves are extraordinary. The sandstone here is layered in bands of different colors, rose and cream and amber and rust, and a deep purple red that looks, in certain lights, like dried blood, and the layers tilt and curve and fold in geological patterns that make the walls seem to move as you walk past them, the strata bending and sweeping in curves that follow the ancient pressures of the rock. The Nabataeans carved niches into these walls, small votive niches, places to set offerings, or small divine images, so that the whole gorge was, in effect, a sacred space. The approach to the city, also the approach to the divine, the walk from the ordinary world to the city, also a walk through a landscape dense with the presence of the sacred. Listen as you walk. The Sick amplifies sound in strange ways. Your footsteps echo off the close walls, the distant sound of water in the rock channel that the Nabataeans carved into the right-hand side of the gorge to direct the seasonal floodwaters away from the city. Every sound returns to you, intimate and altered, and the light changes as you go. Sometimes the gorge opens slightly, and the sun reaches the floor, and the rock blazes with color. Sometimes it narrows, and the light dims to a cool grey-blue shadow, and you feel the temperature drop perceptibly, the rock releasing the cold it has stored from the desert night. And then, at the end, there is the turn. The gorge curves, the last curve, and through the gap between the walls you see, framed by the red rock, at first only partially visible, and then, as you round the final bend, in full, the Treasury, the great facade blazing in the morning light, the columns and the pediment and the urn at the top, all of it rose-red and enormous and absolutely still. The first view of the Treasury is one of the most theatrical moments in all of architectural experience. Not because the building is the largest, not even because it is the most beautiful, though it is among the most beautiful, but because of the approach, because the sick has spent 1 kilometer and 200 meters preparing you, stripping the ordinary world away, narrowing your world to rock and echo and the ribbon of sky, so that when the facade appears, it appears all at once, complete, impossible, real. This is not an accident. The Nabataeans were masters of theatrical space, of the manipulation of arrival, of the architectural drama of reveal. The sick leading to the Treasury is as carefully designed as any theatrical proscenium, and the stage that appears at the end of it is precisely calibrated to take the breath away. What is the Treasury? This is a question whose answer has been debated for longer than anyone has been studying Petra seriously. The name, as we have noted, is the Bedouin name, based on the legend of the pharaoh's hidden gold. But it is certainly not a treasury in any literal sense. There is no evidence of stored valuables here. The building behind the great carved facade is relatively simple. A large anteroom with side chambers, and a main chamber beyond. It is carved entirely from the living rock. Not built, but excavated. Every element of it cut into the cliff from the outside in. The columns not freestanding, but carved from the solid stone in which they remain embedded. The scholarly consensus, though it is not unanimous, is that the Treasury was a tomb, a royal tomb, almost certainly, given its scale and splendor, carved for one of the great Nabataean kings, most plausibly Aretas III of the 1st century BCE. Some scholars have suggested it was a mausoleum temple, combining the royal tomb with a place of worship, a kind of monument to the divine dead that has parallels elsewhere in the Hellenistic world. The urn at the top, the Treasury the Bedouin shot at, is hollow, as later investigations confirmed, and contains no gold. It is simply a carved stone urn, a decorative element at the summit of the facade, placed there not to store treasure, but to complete the architectural composition. And the architectural composition is extraordinary and worth looking at carefully, because it tells us a great deal about how the Nabataeans saw themselves and what influences they were working with. The lower story of the facade is classical Hellenistic, 2 pairs of engaged columns on either side of the doorway, Corinthian capitals carved with extreme delicacy, a full entablature architrave, frieze, cornice above them. The figures in the half pediments on either side of the tholos, the round temple on the upper story, are female figures on horseback, identified as the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, the divine twins of the Greek world, guardians of travellers, which is perhaps fitting for the capital of a caravan city. On the upper story, a circular tholos structure, a broken pediment with a rounded top, a characteristically Hellenistic Baroque element found in Alexandrian architecture. And in the central niche of the upper story, a female figure identified by most scholars as Isis, the Egyptian goddess, heavily syncretized in this period with the Arabian goddess Al-Uzza, one of the 3 great goddesses of the Nabataean pantheon. Egypt and Greece and Arabia, in a single facade. The Nabataeans, looking at the world from their desert valley, absorbed everything and made it their own. The Kazner is the most famous building in Petra, but it is far from the only one. As you move beyond it, deeper into the valley, the city opens up around you with a profligacy of carved stone that becomes, after a while, overwhelming in its abundance. Not one carved facade, but hundreds. Not one tomb, but hundreds. The cliffs on every side carved and pitted and honeycombed with the tombs and temples and homes and civic buildings of a city that grew for 5 centuries and left its entire biography in stone. Let me take you through it slowly, the way the city deserves to be taken, part by part, each area its own revelation. Breathe. You are inside the valley now, And what surrounds you is not just beautiful but staggering in its sheer scale. The scale of human effort required, over centuries, to carve so much rock, to cut so many facades, to hollow so many chambers from the living stone. The valley of Petra is not large, perhaps 2 kilometers from the end of the sick to the far end of the settled area. But within that space, the Nabataeans packed an entire city's worth of function and monument, most of it carved directly from the red and amber and rose-colored sandstone that is the medium, the material, and the color of everything here. Let us walk through it, and I will try to show you what I see. Coming out of the sick and past the Treasury, you enter a broader open area, the beginning of the canyon floor that the Nabataeans used as their main civic space. To your right, the cliff face continues with more tombs, smaller than the Treasury, simpler, but each with its carved facade, its Nabataean decorative elements, its niche and doorway cut into the stone. These are the tombs of the wealthy and the prominent. Not the royal family, but the merchant elite, the high priests, the senior officials of the Nabataean state, men and women whose names we know from inscriptions, whose lives we can partially reconstruct, who chose to spend their wealth on the permanence of carved rock, rather than the perishability of built structures. Ahead of you, the canyon widens into what was the heart of the ancient city, the colonnaded street, the marketplace, the civic and religious buildings. Petra was not only a carved city, it was also a built city, with structures of cut stone and mortar and timber that have mostly not survived the centuries, as well as the carved facades, but whose foundations and scattered architectural elements we can still find and read. There was a colonnaded street in the Roman style, with a broad paved roadway flanked by covered walkways and shops behind them, the same basic civic infrastructure you would find in any prosperous city of the Eastern Roman Empire, because in the 1st century CE, as Roman influence grew, the Nabataeans were already adapting their city to Roman urban conventions. There was a great temple, the one we call Casa el-Bint, the castle of the pharaoh's daughter, the best preserved of the Nabataean temples, its massive outer walls still standing to almost their full original height, built of cut sandstone blocks, facing a broad courtyard across which worshippers approached. There was a theatre, carved into the hillside, with 33 rows of seats cut from the rock, capable of holding perhaps 8,000 people, and with a stage building constructed at its base. There were baths, shops, storehouses, stables, administrative buildings, fountains. Petra was a full and complex city, not just a wonder of carved facades, but a functioning urban organism with all the infrastructure that implies. But the facades are what stay with you. As you move through the valley, they are everywhere, on the cliff of the outer sick before you even reach the main valley, on the Kubtha Massif to your left as you enter, on the great cliffs of the royal tombs ahead of you, on the sandstone plateau behind the main valley, in the secondary valleys that branch off from the main one. The Nabataeans carved into every available cliff face, and there was a great deal of available cliff face, and they carved for centuries. The royal tombs deserve a particular attention. Halfway up the Kubtha cliff on the east side of the valley, cut high into the rock in positions that dominate the view from below, stand 4 tombs that are, by their scale and their prominent position, clearly the burial places of kings or near kings. They are known by names the later travelers and scholars gave them: the urn tomb, the silk tomb, the Corinthian tomb, the palace tomb, each name catching some quality of the facade that gave rise to it. The urn tomb is the largest and the most architecturally remarkable. Its facade stands on a high platform, supported below by a series of arched vaults that elevate it dramatically above the valley floor, the void of the arch, with the sky showing through, visible from below as a dark gap in the cliff face. The chamber behind the facade is the largest inner space in Petra, a great hall carved from the rock, big enough to have been later repurposed as a Byzantine church in the 5th century CE, its walls still showing the carved niches that the Christians added when they converted it. Who was buried here? The inscription inside names a Nabataean king, but the inscription has been damaged, and the name cannot be read with certainty. The palace tomb, at the far right of the sequence, is perhaps the most immediately impressive in scale. It has 5 stories of facade, the upper 3 cut into the rock in the Nabataean manner, and the lower 2 possibly originally constructed and since lost. And it is wide enough to remind one, as it reminded the early modern travellers who named it, of a Roman palace, though it was never a palace of any kind but a tomb complex. The silk tomb owes its name to the quality of the rock at the point where it was carved. Here the sandstone happens to contain bands of particularly brilliant colour, and the carving of the facade has cut through these bands to reveal patterns of rose and cream, and green and purple and amber that ripple across the surface like shot silk in light. It is not architecture at all, in one sense. It is geology, the carving simply revealing what was already there. But in another sense, it is the most Nabataean thing in Petra, because the Nabataeans were people who looked at the desert and saw what was possible in it, who found in the apparently hostile and barren landscape not obstacles but materials, not lack but a different kind of abundance. Beyond the royal tombs, the trail continues up to the high places, the mountain sanctuaries, the open-air altars where the Nabataeans came to worship their gods under the sky. Petra is full of these high places, carved into the ridges and summits of the mountains that surround the valley, accessible by stairways cut into the rock, equipped with altars and libation basins and platforms and cisterns. The most impressive, the high place of sacrifice on the summit of Jabal Madba, offers, from its altar, a view of the whole Petra basin, the valley below with its carved cliffs and its monuments and its foundations of the built city, the desert beyond, the mountains of Edom fading into the haze, the whole world of the Nabataeans spread out below the feet of whoever stood at the altar and made their offering to the sky. Who were the gods they worshipped up here? The gods of the Nabataeans are, like so much of Nabataean culture, a synthesis, a meeting of desert Arabian tradition with the Hellenistic religious world, with Egyptian influences, with the broader Semitic inheritance of the ancient Near East. They are also, in part, a mystery. The Nabataeans were not great theological writers, and we have nothing like the rich corpus of myth and religious literature that illuminates Greek or Egyptian or Mesopotamian religion. What we have are inscriptions. Thousands of Nabataean inscriptions, many of them dedications to the gods, many of them funerary texts, from which we can reconstruct the broad outlines of the divine world, but not its depth. The great god of the Nabataeans was Dushara, a name that means, approximately, he of the Shara Mountains, the Shara being the range of mountains in which Petra sits, the god of the place, the divine power of the specific landscape. Dushara is the supreme deity, the king of the Nabataean pantheon, the god whose name appears most frequently in the inscriptions, to whom the greatest temples were dedicated, whose image, often represented not in human form, but as an abstract block of black stone, a betel, a non-representational divine symbol, was carried and worshipped. The aniconic tradition, the tradition of representing the divine through abstraction rather than human image, is deeply rooted in Semitic religion, and the Nabataeans partook of it. The most sacred image of Dushara was not a statue of a man or a god-king, but a block of stone, dark and smooth and charged with the presence of the divine, which the Nabataeans carried in their processions and set up in their sanctuaries and fed with incense and oil. Alongside Dushara stood the three great goddesses, the Arabian triad of Al-Utsa, Alat, and Manat, whose worship ran through the whole Arabian world and whose names appear in the Quran, centuries later, as the false goddesses whom the Prophet condemned. Al-Uzza, the mighty, was associated with the planet Venus, with power and strength and the wild forces of the natural world, and she was heavily syncretized with Aphrodite and with Isis, so that in Petra she appears in a double or triple identity, sometimes in the flowing robes of Aphrodite, sometimes in the headdress of Isis, sometimes in her own desert form. Alat was syncretized with Athena. Manat, the goddess of fate and time and death, was the most austere of the three. These are the great Nabataean deities, but the divine world of Petra was much fuller than a short list suggests. Nabataean religion was syncretic and inclusive. The traders who came to Petra from every corner of the known world brought their own gods with them, and the Nabataeans, characteristically pragmatic, welcomed them. There are inscriptions to Egyptian gods, to Greek gods, to gods of the Arabian interior, to the god whose name was simply Lord of the World. Petra was a city of many peoples and many cults, and its religious landscape reflected this. The most distinctive feature of Nabataean religious practice, the one that links them most directly to the broader Arabian world from which they came, was the cult of the sacred stone. The betel, from the Semitic Bethel, house of God, was an abstract stone object charged with divine presence, set up in niches in the cliff faces and in the facades of buildings, and in the open-air sanctuaries. Thousands of betel niches survive in the rock faces of Petra and the surrounding landscape. Simple carved recesses containing a block, or a carved face, or nothing at all but the empty hollow that once held the sacred stone. This is the religion of the desert, stripped to its essentials. Not the elaborate narrative mythology of the Mediterranean world, not the theological complexity of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but the simple, powerful sense that the divine is present in certain stones, certain places, certain mountains, that the sacred can be located and approached without images, without stories, with just the offering and the silence and the presence. The Nabataean kings were the servants of the gods, as kings always are in the ancient world, the intermediaries between the human and the divine, responsible for maintaining the cults, building and adorning the temples, making the offerings, ensuring the divine favor on which the kingdom's prosperity depended. And the Nabataean kings expressed this responsibility, above all, in stone, in the extraordinary architecture of the carved city, in the temples and the tombs and the sacred high places, in the facades that are at once civic monuments and religious statements, the permanent record of a people's relationship to their gods and to the land in which they lived. It is time now to meet the greatest of those kings, and to look at the kingdom he built at its height. He called himself, in the inscriptions he left behind, Aretas the Philopatris, Aretas, lover of his people. In Greek, the same title was rendered Philodomos, lover of the people. In either language, in either script, the message was the same. This king's legitimacy rested not only on military strength or divine favor, but on his relationship to his people, on a claim to popular affection that was, even in the ancient world, a relatively unusual thing for a monarch to emphasize. Aretas IV reigned from 9 BCE to 40 CE, a remarkable 49 years, one of the longest reigns in the Nabataean record, spanning a period of extraordinary transformation in the ancient world. He came to power just as Rome was consolidating its grip on the eastern Mediterranean under Augustus, and he reigned through the early years of Roman imperial expansion into the east. He watched the birth and death of Herod the Great, the troubled reign of Herod's successors, the annexation of Judea as a Roman province. He maintained Nabataean independence through all of it, paying tribute when necessary, maneuvering with his characteristic diplomatic skill, never quite submitting and never quite provoking Rome to the full military response that would have ended his kingdom. It was Aretas IV who, more than any other single ruler, gave Petra the form we know from its ruins. Under his reign, the city reached its maximum size and its greatest architectural ambition. The great temples, the colonnaded street, the theatre, all were either built or greatly expanded in his time. The royal tombs cut into the Kubtha cliff may include his own burial. The coinage of his reign is among the finest produced by any Nabataean king. His profile on the obverse, dignified and forceful, with his Nabataean title and the epithet lover of his people, written in the elegant Nabataean script. And alongside him, on his coins, appears his wife, or his wives. Nabataean coinage, unusually for the ancient world, regularly depicted the queen beside the king, her profile matched to his on the coin's obverse, her name written with his in the legend. This is not just a decorative choice, it reflects something real about the status of women in Nabataean society. The queens of Petra, the women who bore the title Shakilat or Gamilat or other Nabataean royal names, were more prominent in public life than the queens of most ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. They appeared on coins. They were named in dedications. Several held the title Queen of the Nabataeans, apparently in their own right, not merely as appendages to a royal husband. One queen, Shakilat, is known from the inscriptions to have held power as regent during the minority of a king, and her inscriptions credit her with building projects and religious dedications as if she were a ruler in her own right. The evidence is fragmentary, as always with the Nabataeans, but it suggests a society in which elite women had a degree of public visibility, and perhaps real political agency, that contrasts interestingly with their counterparts in the Greco-Roman world. This is consistent with what we know of the broader structure of Nabataean society. The Nabataeans, descending from a tribal desert culture, retained certain practices of tribal equality and social mobility that the more rigidly stratified settled societies of the ancient world had long since lost. Women played important roles in the caravan economy, as traders, as owners of goods, as managers of households that were also commercial enterprises. The inscriptions record women as dedicants of temples and altars, as purchasers of tomb rites, as signatories to commercial documents. They were not invisible in the way that women are invisible in many ancient records. Aretas IV died in 40 CE and was succeeded by his son Malichus II, who reigned until 70 CE. Under Malichus II, Petra continued to develop, but the political situation was becoming more complex. Rome was tightening its grip on the eastern Mediterranean. The Jewish revolt of 66-70 CE, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Great Dispersal, convulsed the whole region, and brought Roman military presence very close to Nabataean borders. The writing was beginning to appear, slowly, on the wall. After Malichus II came Rabble II, the last king of the Nabataeans, who reigned from 70 to 106 CE. Under Rabble, the capital of the kingdom seems to have shifted gradually northward, from Petra to Bostra in the Haran, a move that may have reflected changing commercial geography. The northern trade routes through Syria were growing more important relative to the southern Hajj routes, or political calculation, or simply the personality of a king who preferred the north. Bostra grew in importance, Petra's primacy diminished, and when, in 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabataean kingdom and created the province of Arabia Petraea from its territory, the transition was apparently peaceful. No Roman invasion, no battle, no military conquest. Rabble II died without an heir who could claim the throne, or chose not to fight, or made a deal. The exact circumstances are not recorded, and the silence around the annexation is itself one of the fascinating puzzles of Nabataean history. Rome absorbed the kingdom, and the long era of the desert kings was over. But the story of the Nabataeans does not end with the annexation. It continues, in the changed city, in the remarkable water systems, in the script that outlived the kingdom, and in the slow and beautiful story of Petra's rediscovery centuries later. Before we come to the ending, let us dwell a while in the middle, in the height of the kingdom, in the carved city, in the years of its greatest life and fullness. Let me take you to the water. Of all the achievements of the Nabataeans, the carved facades, the trading empire, the diplomatic finesse, the alphabet, the one that strikes me as the most revealing of who they were is the water systems of Petra. The Valley of Petra sits in one of the driest regions of the ancient Near East. The annual rainfall, as I have mentioned, is roughly 150 millimeters on average, a number that in practice means almost nothing for most of the year, and then, in 1 or 2 or 3 winter storms, a sudden violent rush of water that comes down the canyons in flash floods, powerful enough to carry boulders, lethal to anyone caught in the narrow gorges in a storm, and then gone, soaked into the rock or evaporated in the desert sun before any ordinary human system could capture it. The Nabataeans captured it. What makes their water engineering remarkable is not any single brilliant invention, but the sheer completeness of the system. The way every element connects to every other element, the way the whole valley and its surrounding mountains were treated as a single hydraulic system. Every surface designed to contribute to the collection and storage and distribution of the rare and precious water. Let us follow the water from sky to city. Rain falls. In the Petra Basin, when rain falls, and it falls rarely and suddenly, it falls onto the sandstone plateau and cliffs that surround the valley. The sandstone is porous enough that some of this water soaks in, but a significant fraction runs off the surface, flowing down the cliffs in temporary streams, gathering in the canyon floors and rushing toward the valley. The Nabataeans intercepted it before it got there. All around the Petra Basin, on the hillsides and in the smaller tributaries, they cut channels in the rock, shallow troughs, precisely leveled to carry water at a controlled gradient, directing the runoff away from the destructive flash flood path and toward the cisterns. They built small dams, check dams, weirs, settling basins, to slow the water, to let the silt drop out, to store the water for longer periods. They cut steps into the rock at intervals along the channels so that excess water in a heavy storm could spill over in a controlled way, rather than overwhelming the system. Into the valley itself, they cut cisterns, rock-cut tanks, hidden away in the cliff faces and beneath the plateau surfaces, covered against evaporation, sealed against contamination. Some of these cisterns are enormous. The Great Cistern on the Sick Plateau could hold hundreds of thousands of litres, and they were connected by channels and pipes so that excess water could be transferred between them. The cisterns were plastered on the inside with a hydraulic lime plaster that sealed the rock against seepage, and this plaster is itself a remarkable piece of engineering. It is made from burned local limestone, ground and mixed in specific proportions, and in some of the cisterns it has survived 2,000 years without significant deterioration. The pipes are another wonder. The Nabataeans moved water around the city through ceramic pipes, not the lead pipes of the Roman world, but fired clay pipes, fitted together in segments, sealed at the joints, buried in the ground or embedded in the rock. They ran for remarkable distances, crossing the valley floor and threading through tunnels in the rock, carrying spring water from sources outside the city to fountains and basins within it. The pipes were standardized, The Nabataean ceramic industry produced them in regular sizes that could be assembled and disassembled and repaired, a modular system for a hydraulic infrastructure. And then there was the problem of the Sick itself. The Sick, the great entrance gorge, was also the main natural drainage channel for the floodwaters that accumulated in the Petra basin. When the winter storms came and the flash floods rushed down from the surrounding mountains, the water channeled through the Sick with terrifying force, precisely the same force that had carved the gorge over millions of years, and a city in the valley below the Sick was, in principle, at the mercy of these floods. A serious storm could send a wall of water down the gorge and into the city. The Nabataeans blocked the Sick, or rather, they did something more elegant. They diverted the flood water away from the Sick and into a bypass tunnel cut through the rock, so that the flood water that would otherwise rush through the gorge was instead redirected into a separate channel that looped around the outside of the valley and deposited the water harmlessly on the far side. The entrance to this tunnel, the great dam that blocked the Sick, was one of the most ambitious pieces of Nabataean engineering, a structure that controlled the flow of entire seasonal floods and redirected them away from the city. And within the Sick itself, now safe from catastrophic flooding, the Nabataeans installed a dual water system. On one side, a channel for the clean spring water brought from the Ain Musa spring several kilometers away, flowing into the city for drinking and for the ornamental fountains and pools. On the other side, a channel for the controlled runoff from the cliff faces above, directed into systems within the gorge itself. The city that all this engineering served was, at its peak, a real city, with a population probably in the range of 20 to 30,000 people, sustained in one of the driest inhabited places on Earth, by water that had been captured and stored and distributed with extraordinary ingenuity. The springs, the cisterns, the channels, the pipes, together they formed a system sophisticated enough that a city could exist here, that people could drink and cook and bathe and maintain their houses and gardens, that fountains could play in the public spaces, and that the gardens of the wealthy could be watered in a land where every drop had been thought about and planned for, and carefully directed to where it would do the most good. This is the Nabataean approach to the desert. Not denial, not resignation, not the adjustment of expectations downward, but the full engagement of intelligence with the specific, unforgiving geography of the place, and the engineering of abundance from apparent scarcity. The same minds that traced the routes of the caravans across hundreds of kilometers of desert, that built a commercial empire from a stone valley, that carved a city of extraordinary beauty from the rock. Those minds applied themselves to water and made the desert city not just possible but sustainable, and made it flourish for 500 years. Let us now follow the goods that came to this city and understand what happened when the Romans came. A caravan approaches. You are standing, in your imagination, on one of the ridges above the Petra Valley, in the late afternoon of a spring day 2,000 years ago, and you are watching the caravan come in. It has been on the road for many days, weeks perhaps, if it has come from southern Arabia, or months if the goods it carries have travelled the full length of the incense road from the frankincense country. The camels are visible from a long way off, a dark moving line against the pale desert, raising a thin plume of dust that drifts eastward in the afternoon wind. Now they descend toward the valley, and as they approach the gorge entrance their voices rise, the deep grunting of loaded camels, the calls of the drivers, the creak and clank of loaded panniers. They file into the gorge, one by one, the columns stretching back into the desert behind. The gorge swallows them, and then, at the other end, in the valley, they emerge. What happens next is the economic heartbeat of the Nabataean kingdom. The caravan is met by officials, customs agents, inspectors, the representatives of the royal treasury, who examine the goods and assess the duty. Everything must be declared, everything counted and weighed and recorded. The incense, sacks of frankincense perhaps, or jars of myrrh, or the small pellets of high-grade olibanum that were the most valuable of all, is unloaded and stored in the great warehouses near the market area. The luxury goods from the east, the silk, the spices, the precious stones, are sorted and warehoused or passed directly to the merchants who have come to Petra from the Mediterranean world to buy them. The animals are fed and watered. The caravan leaders are housed. In the caravanserais, the great stopping places, essentially hotels for caravan merchants, with stabling for the animals and rooms for the men and facilities for cooking and washing and the transacting of business, the commerce of the ancient world comes to rest for a night or a week before moving on. Petra had multiple caravanserais, and the life that went on in them, the meetings of merchants from Egypt and Syria and Arabia and Persia and India, the negotiations over prices and quantities and routes, the exchange of news and intelligence from across the known world, was as important to the Nabataean economy as the physical goods themselves. Petra was not just a transit point, it was a market, a meeting place, a place where the information economy of the ancient world was conducted alongside its material economy. What did Petra export? The question is more interesting than it might seem, because the Nabataeans were not in the beginning exporters of manufactured goods in the way that, say, the Greeks were exporters of pottery and metalwork, or the Phoenicians exporters of glass and purple dye. Their primary export was service, the service of safe passage, of water and supplies, of guides and protection, of market access. But over time, as they grew wealthy and settled and sophisticated, the Nabataeans did develop manufactures of their own that were traded across the ancient world. To call it pottery seems inadequate. Nabataean painted ware is among the most extraordinary ceramic production of the ancient world, distinguished by its extraordinary thinness. The walls of some vessels are paper-thin, less than 2 millimeters, thinner than much porcelain, its perfectly even firing, and its decoration, a delicate paintwork of floral and geometric motifs applied in dark paint on the cream or orange ground of the fired clay, with a sureness and elegance of line that suggests an artistic tradition of the highest caliber. Nabataean painted ware was traded across the ancient world. It has been found in Egypt, in Syria, in the Arabian interior, in sites as far away as the Aegean, and it represents the aesthetic sensibility of a people who could make things of extraordinary refinement in a desert environment that seemed to offer nothing but rock. There was also the bitumen trade. The Dead Sea, the great hypersaline lake that lies at the lowest point on the Earth's surface, within Nabataean territory, produces natural asphalt that rises from the lake floor and floats to the surface in chunks. This bitumen was exported throughout the ancient world for use as a caulking agent on ships, as a mortar in construction, as an ingredient in waterproofing compounds, and, most lucratively, as an embalming agent. Egyptian mummification consumed enormous quantities of bitumen, and for much of the Hellenistic period, the Nabataeans controlled this supply. The Dead Sea bitumen trade was not as glamorous as frankincense, but it was reliable and profitable, and it is one of the more intriguing of the Nabataean commercial monopolies. The luxury goods of Petra are visible in its art and architecture. The quality of the carved stone, the imported materials, the lapis lazuli, the purple-veined marble, the Egyptian granite, used in the great buildings, the fine metalwork and glass and painted pottery found in the tombs. Petra was a wealthy city, and its wealth shows. But beneath the luxury, the commerce, the official traffic of the caravans, the city also had the texture of everyday life, the workshops where the pottery was made and the metalwork was done, the markets where ordinary goods were bought and sold, the houses of ordinary people with their ordinary domestic concerns. We have evidence of all of this. The grinding stones and the cooking pots and the agricultural tools and the small votive objects and the personal ornaments that constitute the archaeology of daily life in any ancient city. The people of Petra were not all merchants and kings. Most of them were people who lived and worked and cooked and worshipped and died in the ordinary rhythms of a city, sustained by the extraordinary geography and the extraordinary commercial system that their predecessors had built, but living lives that were, in their dailiness, not so different from the lives of ordinary people in any ancient city. And they left, in the rock, the record of their presence, in the thousands of graffiti scratched into the Nabataean sandstone throughout the region, not the official inscriptions of kings and priests, but the casual marks of ordinary people, travelers and camel drivers and herdsmen leaving their names in the rock, the ancient equivalent of "I was here." These Nabataean graffiti are found across an enormous area, not just in Petra, but throughout the Sinai and the Hejaz and the Negev, wherever the caravan routes ran, wherever the Nabataean world extended. They are written in the Nabataean script, that elegant calligraphic cursive that would, in its later evolution, give birth to the Arabic alphabet. It's time to speak of the script. Of all the things the Nabataeans gave to the world, the most lasting, more lasting even than the carved facades of Petra, which are fixed in their valley and cannot be moved, is their script. The Nabataean alphabet is the direct ancestor of the Arabic alphabet, the writing system in which the Quran is written, in which Arabic literature and science and philosophy and poetry are written, in which more than 400 million people communicate today. Every letter of the Arabic alphabet traces a genealogy back through intermediate forms to the Nabataean cursive, and the Nabataean cursive traces its own genealogy back to the Aramaic alphabet of the ancient Near East. The line of descent is direct and well documented. The Nabataeans did not invent writing from scratch, no people does. But they took an existing alphabetic tradition and developed it into a form that would prove, across the centuries, to be one of the most influential scripts in the history of human communication. The alphabet the Nabataeans used was based on Aramaic, the international diplomatic and commercial language of the ancient Near East, the lingua franca of the Persian Empire and of the Levant, a Semitic language that was being written in a cursive alphabetic script from at least the 9th century BCE. When the Nabataeans became literate, and the transition from the nomadic oral culture of their origins to the literate culture of the trading kingdom was not a sudden one. They adopted the Aramaic script as their medium, as did many peoples in the region, but they developed it in their own direction. The Nabataean scribes, writing rapidly in a commercial context, documenting transactions, contracts, property records, dedicatory inscriptions, the business of a busy trading kingdom, developed a cursive style that linked the letters of a word in a continuous flowing line, lifting the pen as rarely as possible. This cursive tendency, driven by the practical requirements of speed and efficiency in commercial writing, gradually changed the shapes of the letters. They became more rounded, more flowing, more connected, more abbreviated. The individual letters that in the older Aramaic script were distinct and separate became, in mature Nabataean, letters that joined naturally to their neighbours, the whole word flowing from right to left in a continuous, elegant stroke. And from this mature Nabataean cursive, in the period of transition between the late Nabataean kingdom and the early Islamic period, roughly the 4th to the 7th centuries CE, emerged what we recognize as the Arabic script. The evolution can be traced through intermediate scripts, particularly the script found in inscriptions from the region of Sinai and northwestern Arabia, sometimes called Proto-Arabic, which shows the transition clearly, and the relationship between mature Nabataean and early Arabic is close enough that scholars in the early modern period who first encountered Nabataean inscriptions sometimes mistook them for Arabic, so similar were the scripts. This is a remarkable inheritance. The people who carved the facades of Petra and traded frankincense across the ancient world also handed to the future one of its most important systems of written communication, the Arabic alphabet, with its distinctive flowing cursive character, its letter forms that connect and flow and circle back on themselves in the calligraphic tradition that would become one of the great art forms of the Islamic world. All of this descends from the Nabataean scribes who sat in Petra and in the caravan stops of the Hejaz and wrote their transactions in the rapid, flowing script that was the commercial language of a desert kingdom. And the Nabataean inscriptions themselves, the thousands of texts they left behind, informal inscriptions cut into the facades of their tombs and temples and in the casual graffiti of caravan routes, are one of our primary sources for the Nabataean world. They tell us the names of the gods and the kings and the dedicants. They record commercial transactions, property sales, tomb rites. They commemorate the dead with brief, formulaic but sometimes poignant texts. This is the grave of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, may he be remembered. They mark the passage of travellers through the landscape. They are the voices of the Nabataean world, speaking in their own script, their own language, across 2,000 years. The Nabataean language itself, the language in which these inscriptions are written, is a form of Aramaic, substantially influenced in its vocabulary by the Arabic of the caravan merchants who made up a large part of the Nabataean population. It is one of the languages we call Ancient North Arabian in the broader classification of Semitic languages, and it is closely related to the classical Arabic of the Islamic period. In a real sense, the language of the Nabataean inscriptions is recognizable to anyone who reads classical Arabic today. Not identical, but close, a cousin rather than a stranger. So when you stand in Petra and look at the inscription on a tomb facade, at the elegant, flowing Nabataean letters carved into the rose-red sandstone, the text running right to left in the Semitic manner, you are looking at the ancestor of one of the world's great written traditions. You are looking at the precursor of the Quran's calligraphy, of the Persian and Ottoman manuscript traditions, of the hundreds of millions of Arabic script texts written across the centuries. The connection runs direct and unbroken from the Nabataean scribe's stylus to the modern pen. The relationship between the Nabataean kingdom and Rome is one of the most interesting long-distance relationships in ancient history, a dance between a small desert kingdom and the greatest empire in the world, lasting for over a century and a half, ending not in conquest, but in what looks, from the limited evidence, almost like a mutually agreed absorption Rome first became seriously involved with Nabataean affairs in the period of Pompey's eastern campaigns in the 60s BCE. As we have seen, the Roman legate Scaurus marched against the Nabataeans, found the desert a more formidable opponent than the Nabataean army, and settled for tribute. This would be the pattern for the next century. Rome threatening, the Nabataeans negotiating, tribute changing hands, independence preserved. The most dramatic Roman-Nabataean military confrontation came in 26-25 BCE, when the Roman prefect of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, led a catastrophic expedition down the Red Sea coast of Arabia in an attempt to reach the frankincense-producing regions and bring them under direct Roman control, eliminating the Nabataean middlemen entirely. The expedition was a disaster. The Roman army, guided by a Nabataean official named Sylleus, whose role in the disaster was disputed and denounced by the ancient sources, found the Arabian desert even more deadly than the Negev. Disease and thirst killed far more Roman soldiers than the enemy. The expedition reached well into Yemen and then retreated, having accomplished essentially nothing, and Aelius Gallus returned to Egypt in disgrace. The failure of the Gallus expedition illustrates something important about the Roman relationship with the Nabataean kingdom. Rome could have simply annexed the Nabataean territory by force. Its military superiority was not in doubt, but the desert made annexation expensive and the risk of failure embarrassing. More importantly, a Nabataean kingdom that collected the caravan tolls and paid a portion to Rome in tribute was economically more efficient than a Roman province that would have to be administered and garrisoned at considerable cost, while the commercial intelligence for running the caravan system resided in the local population anyway. The Nabataeans were worth more to Rome alive and cooperative than subdued and hostile. This calculus changed slowly over the 1st century CE, as Roman influence in the region deepened. Roman Egypt was an important commercial power. The Roman eastern frontier was increasingly fortified. The network of client kingdoms that Rome preferred for the awkward borderlands, keeping local dynasties in place as nominally independent rulers who nonetheless served Roman interests, was gradually being replaced, as Rome's administrative confidence grew, by direct provincial administration, and the Nabataean kingdom, under Rabble II, seems to have been prepared for this, or unable to prevent it, or perhaps, the suggestion has been made, to have actually welcomed it, in the sense that the absorption of the kingdom into the Roman Empire formalized a relationship that already existed in practice and gave the Nabataean elite access to the full social and economic opportunities of the Roman world, rather than the more constrained options of a client kingdom. When Trajan's governor Cornelius Parma annexed the kingdom in 106 CE and created the province of Arabia Petraea, Arabia of the Rock being Petra, the transition was orderly. No revolt, no massacre, no burning. Petra became a Roman provincial city, its new name now Petra Metropolis Arabia. The colonnaded street was built or expanded in the Roman style. New temples were erected with Roman architectural elements. The Roman road network connected Petra to the broader imperial highway system. The city, now inside the empire, continued to live, for a while, but the commercial logic that had built Petra was changing. The Roman annexation of Arabia Petra happened at the same moment that the empire was developing new sea routes for the eastern trade, direct maritime routes from Egypt to India that bypassed the overland incense road entirely. The Nabataean kingdom had been built on controlling the terrestrial route. As the maritime route grew in importance, the overland road carried less traffic. Petra still mattered, but it mattered less. The commercial heart of the eastern trade moved north and east, toward Palmyra and the Euphrates route, and south, toward the Red Sea ports, and so Petra declined, slowly, over the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, not in catastrophe, but in gradual diminishment. The population shrank, the buildings fell into disrepair, the elaborate water systems that had sustained the desert city were maintained with decreasing rigor. A series of earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries damaged the structures. The Byzantine period left its mark. The Great Urn Tomb repurposed as a church, some Christian buildings erected among the Nabataean ruins. But even the Byzantine presence was thin. By the 7th century, when the Islamic conquest swept through the region, Petra was already largely abandoned. And then the centuries of silence came. For more than 1,000 years, Petra was lost. Not completely lost. The Bedouin of the region, the Bedouin tribe in particular, knew the valley and used it, grazing their flocks in the canyon and sheltering in the carved chambers and making their homes in the caves and the rock-cut rooms that the Nabataeans had left. They kept the name, in altered form. They knew the treasury by its local name, the Kuzna. They had legends about the place, that a pharaoh had hidden his treasure in the great urn at the top of the facade, that the carved buildings were the work of jinns or of ancient sorcerers. But to the wider world, to the world of European scholarship and exploration that was, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, beginning to take serious interest in the antiquities of the Near East, Petra was a name from ancient texts, a city that might or might not be identifiable with any known ruins, located somewhere in the vague southern reaches of the former Roman province of Arabia. The great travellers of the era, men like Jean-Louis Burckhardt and his predecessors, knew that ancient sources placed a remarkable Nabataean city somewhere in the region of Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, but the exact location was unknown, and the Bedouin who controlled the territory were not welcoming to outsiders. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was a Swiss scholar who had come to the Near East in 1809 in the service of the African Association of London, a body devoted to geographical exploration, with the explicit mission of exploring the region. He was remarkably prepared for the task. He had learned Arabic to near-native fluency, had adopted the dress and manner of an Arab traveller, had taken the Muslim name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah, and was travelling in disguise so convincing that he was rarely recognised as European. In 1812, travelling southward through what is now Jordan, he heard rumours of remarkable ruins in a valley guarded by hostile Bedouin, accessible only through a narrow gorge. He believed these ruins might be Petra, but entering the valley on any pretext other than a pilgrimage to a local holy site, the tomb of Aaron, on the mountain above the valley, would arouse the suspicion of the Bedouin guides he would need, and a European seen to be exploring ruins would be identified as a treasure hunter and likely killed. Burckhardt solved the problem with characteristic ingenuity. He announced that he wished to make a sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, asked for a local guide to take him through the valley to the foot of the mountain, and thus legitimately entered the sick. His account of what he found at the other end is one of the most vivid passages in the literature of archaeological exploration. He walked through the narrow gorge. He turned the last corner. The treasury blazed before him in the morning light. He knew immediately what he had found. He kept his reaction under control. Any sign of too great an interest in the ruins would betray him to his guide, and he observed as much as he could, while appearing to observe nothing in particular. He noted the theatre, the great carved tombs, the extent of the ruins, the evidence of the ancient city, and then he completed his sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, descended from the mountain, and left the valley. He was the first European in modern times to enter Petra and report what he had found. His account, published in 1822, Burckhardt had died in Cairo in 1817, before he could see his work through the press, electrified the scholarly world. Petra, the great Nabataean city, long sought, long lost, was found. Within decades, other explorers followed. In 1828, 2 English naval officers, C. L. Irby and J. Mangles, entered Petra and published their observations. In 1839, the American artist David Roberts made the visit that produced the extraordinary lithographs that first brought Petra to a wide European audience, images of the treasury and the royal tombs that were, for many 19th century readers, their first visual impression of the rose-red city. Roberts's images, romantic and luminous and accurate enough to convey the overwhelming scale and colour of the place, made Petra famous beyond the world of scholarship. The 19th century brought increasing numbers of visitors, correspondingly increasing interest from archaeologists, and eventually systematic excavation. The British archaeologist Margaret Murray led the first scientific excavation of Petra in 1929. The Jordanian Department of Antiquities, and later the American Center of Oriental Research, conducted extensive excavations through the 20th century. Work continues today, and Petra still yields surprises. In 2016, a large ceremonial building was discovered beneath the sands of the Central Valley, using satellite imagery, a reminder that even the most studied ancient site can still hold its secrets. And Petra was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. In 2007, it was voted one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The rose-red city carved from the desert, hidden for more than 1,000 years, has become one of the most visited and most photographed ancient sites on Earth. But none of that fame quite captures what it actually feels like to be there. To walk the sick and turn the corner and see the treasury in the morning light. Some things resist their own fame. Some things are bigger than any description of them. Petra is one of those. The Nabataeans left behind several things. Let us count them. They left Petra, The rose-red city in the desert, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, with its carved facades and its water systems and its theatre and its temples, its royal tombs blazing in the afternoon light, and its sick with the ancient channel still visible in the rock floor. Petra is the most visible Nabataean legacy, the one that most people, when they think of the Nabataeans, think of, and it is extraordinary enough that it would be sufficient as a legacy on its own, but it is not the only one. They left the script. The Nabataean cursive that evolved into the Arabic alphabet is a living legacy, in daily use by hundreds of millions of people, embedded in one of the world's major literary and religious traditions. The elegant, flowing forms of Arabic calligraphy, the tradition that produced some of the most beautiful written art in human history, the tiles of the Alhambra and the pages of Quran manuscripts and the inscribed domes of the great mosques, descend from the hurried commercial script of Nabataean merchants writing their transactions in the desert. This is a legacy that reaches forward to the present in the most direct way. Every time an Arabic text is written, the shadow of the Nabataean scribe falls across the page. They left evidence of how to live in the desert. The Nabataean water systems, the cisterns and channels and dams and pipes that made Petra possible, are studied by hydrologists and urban planners today for what they can teach about managing water in arid environments. In a world where desertification and water scarcity are growing problems, the Nabataean achievement of sustaining a city of tens of thousands in one of the world's driest regions is not merely a historical curiosity, but a model, an inspiration, a demonstration that it can be done with ingenuity and intelligence, and the willingness to understand the specific logic of a specific place. They left a trading tradition. The commercial networks the Nabataeans built and managed across the ancient Near East were not, of course, preserved in institutional form beyond the kingdom's annexation, but the routes they identified, the methods they pioneered, the relationships they built between the Arabian interior and the Mediterranean world, these things outlasted the kingdom and influenced the commercial geography of the region for centuries. The great Islamic spice and incense trade of the medieval period followed, in significant part, paths that the Nabataean caravans had first established. They left their gods in the rock, the thousands of betel niches, the carved altars, the sacred high places cut into the Petra mountains. These are the physical residue of a religious tradition that has otherwise largely vanished. The Nabataean gods, Dushara and Aluza and Alat and Manat, were the pre-Islamic gods of the Arabian world, the divine landscape that the Prophet Muhammad encountered and rejected, that the Quran engages with in its complex relationship to the religious traditions of Arabia. In this sense, the Nabataean religion is part of the prehistory of Islam, part of the background against which that religion defined itself. The gods carved in the sandstone niches of the Petra cliffs are the gods whose names echo, in condemnation and displacement, through the sacred text of one of the world's great religions, and they left, perhaps most remarkably, an example of what is possible in a place that seems to offer nothing. A people who began with only the desert and their knowledge of it, who used that knowledge to make themselves indispensable, who turned the water scarcity of their homeland into a skill set that could sustain a city, who looked at a cliff of red sandstone and decided to carve into it a city unlike anything the world had seen before, who maintained their independence among empires for centuries through diplomatic intelligence rather than military power, who developed a script that would outlive their kingdom by 2 millennia and more, who made, in one of the hardest landscapes in the world, something astonishingly beautiful. This is the Nabataean legacy. Not the legacy of a conquering empire, not the legacy of a literary or philosophical civilization that filled libraries with its thought, not the legacy of a military power that shaped the political map of the world, something quieter, and in its way more enduring. The legacy of a desert people who were very, very good at what they did, who saw what was possible where others saw only impossibility, who built with the rock because there was rock, who controlled the water because they understood the water, who traded with the world because they sat at the world's crossroads and understood what that meant. Lie back, now, in the dark where you are, and hold that for a moment. The desert at night, the stars over Petra, not the stars you know from cities, filtered and thinned by light pollution, but the full, overwhelming, uncountable stars of the desert, the stars that the Nabataean caravan leaders navigated by, the stars that wheeled over the rose-red valley in the centuries when the city was alive and full of sound. The stars have not changed. The rock has not changed. The desert is still there, ochre and amber and rose-red, waiting, somewhere in the rock of the Petra Valley, sealed in a tomb cut into the living sandstone 2,000 years ago. there may still lie the bones of kings, of Aretas and Obodas and Rabble, of queens whose names the inscriptions give us and whose faces the coins preserve, of the merchants and priests and water engineers and caravan masters who built and sustained the desert kingdom. We have not found them yet. The valley still holds its secrets. But we have the facades. We have the sick, and the treasury blazing in the morning light. We have the Nabataean script, still alive in the pens of hundreds of millions of writers. We have the water channels cut into the rock, the cisterns still waterproof after 2,000 years. We have the pottery, paper-thin and elegantly painted, sitting in museum cases in Ammon and London and New York. We have the coins with the king's profile and the queen beside him, and the words Aretas, lover of his people, written in the flowing script. We have their story. Before we rest, let us walk the full length of the Nabataean royal line together. Not quickly, but slowly, the way the dynasty deserves. Each reign a chapter in the 500-year story of the desert kingdom. The dynasty begins, in the historical record, with Aretas Highs, the king mentioned in 2 Maccabees in connection with the events of around 1608 BCE, a name that puts the formal beginnings of the Nabataean kingship in the Maccabean period, when the upheavals of the Seleucid Empire were reshaping the whole region. Aretas I is a shadowy figure. We know his name, his general period, and little else. But the fact that his name is the same as that of later, better documented kings tells us something. The name Aretas, which the Greeks rendered Aretas, was a royal name, a name with prestige and tradition behind it, chosen for its associations with the dynastic heritage. After Aretas I came a succession of kings, whose reigns are partly known from coins and inscriptions and occasional mentions in the sources. Rabble I, who reigned in the 2nd century BCE, Aretas II, who appears in the sources around 110 BCE, as a powerful regional ruler, involved in the politics of the Seleucid collapse, a king named Obodas, who achieved such religious significance that he was deified after his death, and worshipped as a god at a sanctuary named Oboda in the Negev. Obodas the Holy, the only Nabataean king we know of, who was formally made divine during or after his reign. His successors sometimes identified themselves as his descendants or devotees, and the cult of Obodas persisted for centuries. Aretas III, whom we have already met, the Philhellene, the diplomatist, the king who paid 300 talents to Scarus, and then minted coins, celebrating himself as a Hellenistic monarch, reigned from around 87 to 62 BCE, a long and consequential reign during which the Nabataean kingdom reached its greatest territorial extent, expanding northward into Syria as the Seleucid Empire collapsed, and began the intensive Hellenization of its court culture that is so evident in the architecture of Petra. Then came a brief and troubled reign, Obodas II, or Obodas III in some accounts, who seems to have been manipulated or overshadowed by the powerful minister Sylleus, the same Sylleus who guided the disastrous Roman expedition of Aelius Gallus. The relationship between Obodas and Sylleus is one of the great political dramas of the Nabataean record, played out at a time when Nabataean politics intersected directly with the politics of the early Roman Empire. Sylleus was ambitious. He sought marriage into the Herodian dynasty. He proposed to Salome, the sister of Herod the Great, a match that would have given him a foothold in the most important client kingdom in Rome's eastern sphere. But the proposal failed. He went to Rome to argue Nabataean interests, and argued them badly, or to advance his own at the expense of his king. He was accused, in the end, of involvement in plots against both Nabataean and Herodian interests, and was executed in Rome, probably around 9 BCE, and the execution of Sylleus coincides with the accession of the greatest king, Aretas IV, whose reign of 49 years we have already discussed, whose coins show him as a forceful and dignified ruler beside his queen, whose building program gave Petra its most famous monuments, whose epithet, lover of his people, is the one that history has preserved. Aretas IV's family life has a particular resonance because of a passage in the New Testament. In the second letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul describes how the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me, and that Paul escaped through the city wall, let down in a basket. This brief mention, in one of the oldest documents of the Christian tradition, places Aretas IV at the moment when the great religious transformation of the ancient world was underway, when the seeds of what would become Christianity were being sown in the same region where the Nabataean kingdom was at its height. Aretas and Paul were contemporaries, moving through the same world, brushing past each other, the Nabataean king and the tent-making missionary, neither perhaps fully aware of the other's eventual historical significance. After Aretas IV came Malichus II, 40 to 70 CE, a reign that coincides with the Jewish revolt and its catastrophic suppression by Titus. Under Malichus II, the Nabataean kingdom faced the full weight of Roman power in its neighborhood, without being consumed by it, maintaining the delicate balance that was the Nabataean political art. And then Rabel II, the last king, whose transfer of the capital to Bostra, and whose death without a viable heir, or whose death followed by a Roman decision not to recognize any heir, ended the royal line. The queens deserve a separate mention, because the Nabataean record is unusually rich in royal women. We have mentioned Shakilat the regent, but there were others. Huldu, whose name appears in the inscriptions of the early kingdom. Gamilat, the name borne by more than one Nabataean royal woman, and the various queens who appear on the coins beside their husbands. Their profiles match to the king's in a way that suggests not just consort status, but real co-rulership, or at least the public representation of shared authority. The most intriguing of the Nabataean queens is perhaps Shakilat II, a figure who appears in the inscriptions of the 1st century CE, holding the title Queen of the Nabataeans, apparently in her own right, making dedications and commissioning works in the way that kings do, her name standing alone, or first rather than second in the dedicatory formulas. Some scholars believe she was a regent for the young Rabel II after the death of Malichus II. Others suggest she held independent authority for a longer period. The evidence is fragmentary, and the debates are ongoing, but the presence of a Nabataean queen exercising something that looks like royal power in her own right is itself remarkable. A reminder that the Nabataean world was not organized along the strictly patriarchal lines that the Greco-Roman world imposed, that the desert tradition from which the Nabataeans came gave women a different standing than the urban traditions of the Mediterranean. Let us rest a while in the sensory world of Petra at its height, because history is not only dates and names and dynasties, it is also the smell of the morning, the sound of the market, the texture of the rock under a hand pressed against it, the specific quality of the light in a gorge of red sandstone at noon. In Petra, the smell was frankincense, not just frankincense. The city smelled of all the goods that passed through it, of camels and dust and spices, and the particular sweet sourness of a large population living in a warm climate, without modern sanitation. But above all, and at all hours, from the temples and the altars and the sacred high places and the private shrines and the caravanserais where the merchants made their offerings before and after a journey, frankincense, the sacred smoke. Frankincense is the resin of boswellia trees, scraped from the bark, allowed to harden into pale yellow or greenish or milky white tears, collected and sorted by grade, and packed into sacks for the long journey north. When burned, it produces a dense, sweet, slightly medicinal smoke, not quite like anything else, with a character that has kept it at the center of religious ritual for 6,000 years, and is still burning in Catholic churches and Orthodox churches and Hindu temples today. The ancient world burned millions of pounds of it every year, in the great temples of Egypt and Greece and Rome and Persia, in the household shrines of ordinary people, in the rituals of birth and death and marriage and harvest. In Petra, frankincense was everywhere. It was the reason the city existed. Its smell would have permeated every space, rising from the temple altars in the white smoke that the Nabataeans believed carried their prayers upward to the gods, seeping from the storehouses where the bales of raw resin awaited redistribution, drifting from the street altars where travelers made their arrival offerings. To live in Petra was to live in the smell of the world's sacred smoke, and alongside frankincense was myrrh, the other great Arabian aromatic, darker and more bitter, also burned as incense but used more extensively in medicine and in embalming, with a sharper, more resinous character, and the spices from the east, cinnamon and cassia and cardamom and pepper, which the Mediterranean world craved and could not produce, and which travelled, as frankincense travelled, through Nabataean hands to the markets of Egypt and Syria and Rome, and the wines of the region, and the dates, and the particular smell of fired pottery cooling in the kiln, and the dusty mineral smell of the sandstone in the heat of the afternoon sun. It was, if you could stand in it, a smell unlike any available today, a compound of the sacred and the commercial, the desert and the Mediterranean, the ancient trade routes and the specific geology of the rose-red valley, the smell of a civilization at the height of its power and its peculiarity. Close your eyes and imagine it, the warmth of the stone, still radiating the day's heat into the cool of the evening, the stars emerging over the narrow band of sky between the carved cliff faces, the last camel complaining in the caravanserai. the distant sound of a water pipe flowing in the channel below the street, the thin thread of incense smoke rising from a betel niche in the cliff face beside you, the stone dark and smooth with the oil poured over it by generations of devotees, the god present in the stone present in the desert present all around you under the stars. This is Petra at night. This is the Nabataean world as it actually was, in the centuries before the decline, before the Roman absorption, before the slow emptying of the valley and the closing of the centuries over it. This is the civilization alive, at its full, breathing and moving and smelling of frankincense. We are nearly at the end. The candles are low, the night has settled deep around you. Your body is heavy and still, your breathing slow. The day's concerns, all the specific, pressing, small and large urgencies of your particular life, have grown distant, the way things always grow distant in the small hours, when the ordinary world releases its hold for a while, and the mind floats free. Let me bring you back to Petra one last time before you sleep. The valley in the morning. Early, before the tourists arrive, before even the sun has cleared the eastern rim of the Kubtha Massif and set the facades blazing. The valley is cool and grey, the rock in shadow, the air perfectly still. You stand at the end of the sick, and ahead of you the Treasury's upper story catches the first thin light above the shadow line, just the urn at the top, just the peak of the broken pediment, glowing rose-pink against the deep grey blue of the still-shadowed cliff, and then the light comes down. It moves down the facade like a slow uncovering. First the urn, then the round tholos, then the upper columns, each element emerging from shadow into colour as the sun climbs above the ridge. The sandstone blazes, not one colour but a dozen, rose and amber and cream and rust, and the deep purple red of the iron-rich bands, all of it alive in the morning light, pulsing with a warmth that seems to come from inside the rock rather than from outside it. This is what Burckhardt saw in 1812. This is what the Nabataean kings ordered carved 2,000 years ago, and what their subjects walked past every morning on their way to market or to temple, or to the workshops where the pottery was being made and the metalwork was being shaped. The same light, the same colours, the same breath of cool morning air just beginning to warm. The rock has not moved, the light has not changed. Across 2,000 years of forgetting and rediscovering and forgetting again, the facade is still there, carved into the permanent stone, speaking in the same silence it has always spoken. The Nabataeans knew about permanence. They were desert people who had lived with the rock long enough to understand what the rock meant, that it outlasted everything, that the carved stone outlasted the man who carved it, and the kingdom that ordered it carved, and the empire that absorbed the kingdom, and every subsequent event that history could bring to bear on it. The rock simply waited. It was there before the Nabataeans, and it will be there long after the last visitor has made the last journey down the sick, and turned the last corner, and seen the last morning light on the Treasury facade. But for the 500 years of their civilization, 500 years is a long time. It is longer than the United States of America has existed as a nation. The Nabataeans lived in the rock, and with the rock, and made the rock theirs. They asked the rock to hold their dead, and the rock holds them still. They asked the rock to carry their water, and the carved channels are still there, worn smooth by 2,000 years of seasonal flow. They asked the rock to hold the images of their gods, and the betel niches are still there in the cliff faces, empty of the sacred stones but still cut and shaped by the hands that carved them. And they asked the script, their flowing, connecting, right-to-left script, to carry their names forward. And the script did more than that. It carried itself forward, evolving and transforming, generation by generation, until it became the vehicle for one of the great literary and religious traditions of humanity. The last Nabataean king died 2,000 years ago, and the script that his scribes used is still in use today. The desert kingdom is gone. The alphabet continues. This is what the Nabataeans left. Not an empire, not a philosophy, not a literature of the scale that survives from Greece or Rome, but a carved city that stops the breath, a script that shaped a civilization, a water system that should have been impossible, and the patient, practical, unsentimental wisdom of desert people who knew that the important things are water and roots and the keeping of the gods satisfied and the next season's pasture and the deal that lets everyone walk away alive. Lie still now. Let the rose-red cliffs rise in the darkness behind your eyes. Let the sick narrow around you, the walls close and tall, the sky a ribbon above. Let the first light find the Treasury facade in the morning quiet, before the day has begun, before the world has woken, in the still cool of the valley that the Nabataeans chose, out of all the valleys in all the deserts of the ancient world, for their home. They were here. They carved their presence into the permanent stone. They sent their script forward through the centuries. They managed their water with extraordinary intelligence. They traded with the whole known world and made themselves necessary to it. And then, as all things do, they passed. But the rock remains. The carved facades remain. The channels in the stone remain. The alphabet remains. The story remains. And you are here tonight, in the dark, listening. The story has reached you, as they reached for the future, as they wrote their inscriptions addressed to whoever should come after. Here you are. You came. You listened. The caravan has made its long journey through the desert and arrived at last. You can rest now. Breathe slowly. Settle deeper into the warm stone of wherever you are resting. The sound of the desert night is around you. The wind across the sandstone, the distant pulse of stars too many to count. The frankincense is smoke now, long since smoke, carried away on the same wind that carries you towards sleep. The Nabataeans built a city in the desert, and it endured. They wrote their names in the rock, and the rock kept them. They made a script, and the script made the world. You are carrying a little of that forward now, into your sleep, into tomorrow, into the ordinary remarkable day that will begin when you wake. Sleep well. Sleep in the shadow of the rose-red cliffs, under the stars that the Nabataean caravan masters knew, on the warm sandstone of the ancient trade routes, in the long memory of the desert that never forgets. The story is told. The city is carved. The franchise of time passes now, from the storyteller to the dreamer. Sleep now. If you are still with me in the darkness tonight, if the Nabataeans have carried you this far, and you are not yet at rest, then leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from, what the night feels like where you are. You are never alone when you listen to these stories. Somewhere in the world tonight, in a dozen different countries, in a dozen different time zones, under skies of a dozen different colors, other people are doing exactly what you are doing, lying in the dark, letting the ancient world carry them towards sleep. We are all doing this together. We always have been. And the Nabataeans, in their carved valley in the desert, were doing it too, gathering in the dark, listening to the stories of their gods and their kings and their dead, letting the voice carry them somewhere else, letting the night do its work. Go now. Sleep now. Among the tens of thousands of people who lived in Petra at its height, the great majority were not kings or priests or water engineers. They were merchants, and the texture of their lives, the daily reality of the commercial city, is worth attending to with some care. Because commerce was not for the Nabataeans merely an economic activity. It was, in a deeper sense, their civilization's fundamental expression. The merchant class of Petra was extraordinarily diverse. Every caravan that arrived in the city brought with it not only goods but people. Caravan masters and their employees, animal handlers and guides, merchants who had travelled part or all of the length of the incense road to buy or sell, agents for distant trading houses, representatives of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid governments who kept a watching brief on the commerce of the routes. Petra's inscriptions record people with Nabataean names, with South Arabian names, with names from the Egyptian world, with Aramaic names, with Greek names, a cosmopolitan roster that reflects the city's role as the meeting point of multiple trading worlds. The great caravan masters, the men who organized and led the major trading expeditions, who assembled the hundreds of camels and the goods to load on them, and the men to tend them, who negotiated the access to waterholes and the fees to local guides along the route, who managed the immense logistical challenge of moving a small army's worth of people and animals across hundreds of kilometers of desert, were among the most powerful men in the Nabataean world. We know some of their names from inscriptions: Koshu Malik, Hawitu, Zubdilu, Nabataean names that appear in dedicatory texts as men of standing, making offerings to the gods in thanks for a safe journey completed, commissioning improvements to the sacred spaces of the city. The organization of a major caravan was not unlike the organization of a military campaign, and some of the skills overlapped. A caravan master needed to know logistics, how much water each camel needed, how much fodder, how much time was required between water sources, how to pace the march so that the animals arrived at each stop in condition rather than exhausted. He needed to know routes, the alternatives as well as the primary road, the bypasses in case of flood or raider or dry well. He needed to know people, the relationships with the tribal leaders whose territory the route crossed, the agreements under which his caravan could pass and be protected, the hospitality obligations and the gift-giving protocols that kept those agreements intact. And he needed to know the markets, where the goods he carried were in demand, what prices to expect, what counter goods he could pick up for the return journey. The camel traders and handlers who made up the working muscle of the caravan economy were a class unto themselves, skilled in the highly specific art of camel management, essential in a world where no other animal could make the desert crossings economical. The Nabataeans were among the earliest and most sophisticated camel pastoralists in the world, and their knowledge of camel breeding, health and management was part of the commercial advantage that the incense trade required. The Nabataean camel, bred and trained for a long desert crossing, was worth more than any other kind of transport available. The knowledge of how to produce and sustain such animals was as valuable as the animals themselves. The craftsmen of Petra are perhaps the most directly visible to us today, because their work survives in the physical fabric of the city. The carvers, the men and women who actually cut the facades from the living rock, were highly skilled stonemasons working in a distinctive tradition that is, as far as we can determine, specifically Nabataean. There are no direct parallels for the Petra style of rock-cut facade in any other culture, no nearby tradition from which the Nabataeans obviously borrowed. The style appears to have been developed locally, in Petra and in the related sites of the Nabataean world, by craftsmen who understood the specific properties of the Petra sandstone, its layering, its relative softness when freshly quarried and freshly cut, its tendency to harden over time as the exposed surface desiccates, and who developed techniques precisely suited to this material and this landscape. The rock cutters worked from the top down. This is the practical logic of carving a facade. You start at the top of the cliff face, where you have maximum access, and where the carved elements will eventually be supported by the untouched rock below, and you work downward, the scaffolding descending as the work progresses. The order of work is visible in some unfinished facades, the upper elements complete, the lower elements partially carved, or the rough outline of the lower half of a composition, still showing the marks of the early stages. And it tells us something about the planning and the phasing of the work, about how a great project was divided into stages and organized across time. What tools did they use? Metal chisels, certainly. The Romans and Greeks and Egyptians used iron chisels for stone carving, and there is no reason to think the Nabataeans differed. The precise, flowing curves of the capitals and the delicate rendering of the figures and ornaments on the facades required skilled hands and sharp tools. The drill was probably used for the deep-cut details, and scaffolding, timber scaffolding, wedged or pegged into the cliff face, the marks of the peg holes still visible in many of the facades, evidence of the wooden infrastructure that has since rotted away. The ordinary domestic crafts of the city, pottery, metalwork, weaving, leatherwork, basket-making, food production, were the daily texture of life. The extraordinary thinness of Nabataean fine pottery was a craft achievement that required not just skill, but a specific kind of wheel, a fast spinning wheel, generating the centrifugal force needed to pull the walls of a vessel to paper thinness, and a mastery of the clay body and the firing conditions that could only be acquired over years of practice. Nabataean pottery workshops were distributed across the city and across the wider Nabataean territory. The fine ware was made in relatively small quantities, clearly for an elite market, while coarser utility ware for everyday use was mass-produced. The painted decoration on the fine ware, the floral scrolls and the geometric borders and the small animal figures, was done with a brush and a pigment that fired to a deep brownish red on the cream or pale orange ground, applied with a freedom and sureness that suggests trained painters who had developed their visual language over many years. The metalworkers of Petra produced jewelry of considerable refinement. The gold and silver work found in the tombs, the elaborate earrings and bracelets and necklaces and finger rings, the decorative elements of weapons and vessels, all attest to a metalworking tradition of the highest quality. The Nabataeans imported their metals. There was no significant metal ore in their territory, and so the metalwork of Petra represents a transformation of imported raw materials, primarily copper and tin for bronze and silver from the east, into finished luxury goods that were traded back out into the same commercial networks that had brought the metals in. And the water engineers, the men who designed and built and maintained the hydraulic systems that made the city possible, were perhaps the most essential of all the craftsmen, though the least visible to us today, because their work was infrastructural rather than decorative, underground and hidden rather than carved on the cliff faces. We know they existed because the system exists, because the systems are cut with a precision that required planning and skill, because the channels are laid at gradients that required survey instruments and mathematical knowledge, because the pipes are standardized in ways that suggest a design intelligence behind the production. But their names are not preserved. They left their work. They did not leave their names. In this they are like most of the builders and engineers and craftspeople of the ancient world. Their contribution is visible in what they made, but they themselves are invisible in the historical record. Lie back a little further. Let the city fill in around you in the darkness. The sounds and smells and textures of the commercial life. The workshop at the end of the street, with the sound of hammer on metal drifting through the afternoon. The potter's wheel turning in the morning cool before the heat sets in. The caravans settling into the caravanserai in the late afternoon. The camels kneeling and groaning as the loads are lifted from them. The merchants stretching their legs after days in the saddle. The smell of the stables and the dust and the incense from the temple across the market square. This was a living city. This is what we too often forget when we look at ancient ruins. We see the stone, the silent stone, and we imagine that silence was always there. But for 500 years, the valley of Petra was full of noise and life, and the complex, contentious, mutually dependent social world of tens of thousands of people living close together. The children playing in the alleyways between the carved cliffs. The arguments in the marketplace. The prayers at the high places. The water flowing in the channels. The camels complaining in the night. All of it gone, now. All of it in the silence of the rock. But once it was as loud and as real and as present as the world you inhabited today. Petra was the capital, the heart, the great carved center. But the Nabataean world extended far beyond the rose-red valley, across a territory that, at its greatest extent, was one of the larger political entities in the ancient Near East. Comparable in size to modern Jordan and larger, stretching from the Gulf of Aqaba in the south to the Hodan in the north, from the Sinai in the west to the edges of the Arabian interior in the east. This was not uniform territory. It was a kingdom of deserts and oases, of agricultural valleys and bare rock plateau, of mountain ranges and flat gravelly plains, of the great Wadi Rum, the Valley of the Moon, the enormous red-sanded corridor through the sandstone massifs of southern Jordan, and the highland country of Moab and Edom, and the volcanic basalt plains of the Horan. The Nabataeans administered all of this, or rather they administered the routes through all of this, the roads and the watering points and the caravanseries and the toll stations, while allowing the diverse populations who lived in the various zones to maintain their local customs and economies under Nabataean political overlordship. Beyond Petra, the Nabataean world expressed itself in a series of secondary cities and way stations that are fascinating in their own right, each a kind of Petra in miniature, each with its own carved monuments and water systems adapted to its specific local geography. Hegra, known today as Madain Saleh in the Hejaz of northwestern Saudi Arabia, inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is perhaps the most spectacular of these secondary sites. Hegra was the second city of the Nabataean kingdom, an important commercial centre on the incense road where the caravans from the frankincense-producing south could rest and resupply before the long haul north to Petra and beyond. And Hegra, like Petra, has remarkable carved rock-cut facades, tombs cut into the golden sandstone outcrops of the Hejaz landscape, with elaborate inscriptions giving the names of the tomb owners, their families, the penalties for unauthorized burial, the dates of the tomb's cutting. The Hegra facades are, if anything, better preserved than those of Petra, the inscriptions crisper, the carvings sharper, because the site was relatively unknown and unvisited until the recent opening of Saudi Arabia to archaeological investigation. They give us an extraordinarily detailed picture of the middle ranks of Nabataean society, the merchant families, the priests, the military officials, the freedmen, all buying their rock-cut tombs and inscribing their names in the stone that would last longer than any living memory. The inscriptions of Hegra are dated. They carry the year of the reigning king in the Nabataean reckoning, and so they give us a precise chronological sequence for the use of the site. The earliest dated tombs are from the reign of Obodas III, around 28-9 BCE. The latest are from the reign of Rabel Tunk, in the last years of the kingdom. This means that Hegra as a Nabataean burial and commercial site was active for roughly a century, not as long as Petra, but long enough to accumulate a remarkable archive of carved inscriptions that are among our most important sources for Nabataean society. Oboda, the city named for the deified king, in the Negev highlands of what is now southern Israel, was another major Nabataean center, and its site has been extensively excavated by Israeli archaeologists over the past several decades. Oboda began as a caravan way station on the route from Petra to the Mediterranean coast, grew into a substantial town, received Roman period development after the annexation, and continued to be inhabited well into the Byzantine period. The Byzantine town that caps the Nabataean and Roman levels at Aboda is one of the best preserved of any ancient site in the Negev, and the whole sequence of occupation, Nabataean trading post, Nabataean town with temple to Aboda's the divine king, Roman provincial city, Byzantine Christian settlement, tells in compressed form the whole story of the region from the 1st century BCE to the 6th century CE. Mamshit, Shifta, Nitsana, other Nabataean and later Byzantine sites in the Negev, together form an extraordinary landscape of ancient occupation in one of the world's least hospitable environments, all of it sustained by the same hydraulic intelligence the Nabataeans applied in Petra: the capture of runoff, the cisterns, the carefully levelled channels, the agricultural terraces that held the thin desert soil against the force of the rare rains. The Nabataean Negev was not merely a transit zone for the caravans. It was an agricultural landscape, settled and farmed by a people who had learnt to coax life from land that looked, to outsiders, like nothing but dust and rock. The port cities deserve their own attention. Ayla, the ancient precursor to modern Aqaba, at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba where the Red Sea's northern arm reaches up toward the Sinai, was the Nabataean gateway to the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean world. Through Ayla came the goods from India and East Africa that arrived by ship at the Red Sea ports and were then transshipped overland for the journey to the Mediterranean markets. The Nabataeans controlled this transshipment, the unloading from the ships, the loading onto the camels, the organization of the overland journey, and charged for it, as they charged for everything on the routes. Ayla was thus a hinge point between two great trading systems, the maritime world of the Indian Ocean and the overland world of the Incense Road, and the Nabataeans who managed it sat at one of the crucial nodes of ancient global commerce. Gaza, on the Mediterranean coast, was the other great port of the Nabataean commercial system, the place where the incense and spices that had travelled the length of Arabia finally reached the sea and were loaded onto ships for Egypt and the Aegean and Rome. Gaza was not formally a Nabataean city. It was a Hellenistic and then Roman city, but it was effectively the western terminus of the Nabataean trade network, the market where the goods the camels had carried arrived at their ultimate buyers. The relationship between the Nabataean kingdom and Gaza is complex in the historical sources. There were periods of Nabataean control and periods of independence, but the commercial connection was permanent, and there was the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth, the hypersaline inland sea that lies at the end of the Jordan Valley, was within Nabataean territory, and its extraordinary properties made it commercially significant in ways that seem bizarre to modern sensibility. The Dead Sea produced bitumen, as I have mentioned, but it also produced salt in enormous quantities, from the evaporation of its supersaturated waters. Salt was a critical commodity in the ancient world, essential for preserving food, for curing leather, for dozens of industrial processes. The Nabataeans controlled the Dead Sea salt production and exported it across the region. The Dead Sea was, in a sense, a chemical factory in the desert, a natural concentration of the minerals dissolved out of the surrounding rock over geological time, and the Nabataeans exploited it with their characteristic thoroughness. This was the Nabataean world, not a desert kingdom cut off from the world, but the opposite. A kingdom that existed precisely because it sat at the intersection of worlds, because its territory spanned the crucial connections between the Indian Ocean trading system and the Mediterranean trading system, between the Arabian incense-producing south and the incense-consuming north, between the desert interior and the fertile coastal lands. The Nabataeans were not isolated. They were the most connected people in the ancient Near East, the pivot on which the whole commerce of their world turned. Everything that made them extraordinary, their water engineering, their carved city, their diplomatic skill, their script, was an expression of this fundamental position, this geographical gift and geographical challenge that required of its inhabitants not the values of conquest, but the values of connection. We have spoken of the gods of the Nabataeans, Dushara, Aluza, Olat, Manat, but the religious landscape of the Nabataean world is richer and stranger than any simple list of divine names suggests. Let me take you deeper into it, because the religion of the Nabataeans is one of the keys to understanding who they were, and it is also one of the direct ancestors of one of the world's great religious traditions. The essential characteristic of Nabataean religion, as I have mentioned, is the betel, the sacred stone, the divine made present in a block or a slab or a roughly shaped rectangle of rock, set up in a niche or on an altar, identified with a specific deity, but never entirely reducible to a representation of that deity in the way that a cult statue is a representation. The betel is not a picture of a god. It is a place where the divine presence is concentrated, a locus, a focus, a stone charged with the sacred by the offerings and the attention of generations of worshippers. This is a very different kind of religious object from the anthropomorphic divine images of the Greek and Roman and Egyptian worlds. The Greek temple with its great cult statue, the Phidias Zeus at Olympia, enormous and gold and ivory, unmistakably human in its form though divine in its scale, locates the divine in the human-shaped body, gives the god a face and a form that believers can recognize and relate to. The Nabataean betel does the opposite. It refuses the human form, insists on the divine incomparability, presents the sacred as something that cannot be contained in any human shape. The betel tradition belongs to a broader Semitic religious culture that runs through the ancient Near East and surfaces in the Hebrew Bible in the stories of Jacob setting up stones and anointing them with oil at Bethel, the Hebrew word for the stone pillar, Masabah, being cognate with the Nabataean concept, and in the persistent Israelite practice of setting up sacred stones on high places that the prophets repeatedly condemned as idolatry. The sacred stone, the anointed pillar, the divine presence located in a specific rock. These are older than any of the specific traditions that would later claim to have transcended them, and they survived in Arabia, in the Nabataean world, into the period of Islam, which would confront them in the sacred stones of the Kaaba, and resolve the conflict by preserving the stone while transforming its meaning. The great god Dushara, whose name connects him to the Shara Mountains, to the specific landscape of the Petra region, had his principal sacred stone at Petra, in the great temple of Qasr al-Bint, where a large black stone was the focus of the cult. The black stone and Dushara would later, in the hands of Byzantine Christian writers who were not friendly to the Nabataean religious tradition, be interpreted as a lingam, as a phallic symbol, as all the things that hostile interpreters of an alien religious tradition like to see. The Nabataean understanding was different. The stone was the god's presence, pure and simple, the material focus for the immaterial divine reality, neither phallic nor specifically shaped as anything at all, but simply the sacred stone, heavy and black and ancient, receiving the offerings of the faithful, and presiding over the city of the rose-red cliffs. The ritual life of Petra centered on the temples and the high places. The great temple in the central valley, Qasr al-Bint, whose massive walls still stand, was the main civic religious center, the place where the great festivals were held, where the king made his public offerings, where the whole city could gather for the ceremonies that marked the rhythms of the religious year. But Petra also had, cut into its mountains, a whole landscape of sacred sites that were used for more intimate devotion. The small carved niches with their betel stones, where an individual or a family could come and pour a libation or burn a pinch of incense in a gesture of private piety. The individual's relationship with the divine maintained through small daily acts of offering, rather than only through the grand public ceremony. The sacred high places were for something else again, for the communal ceremonies that required height and openness, the rituals that were most powerful when conducted under the sky, the offerings that needed the wind to carry the sacred smoke upward toward the gods who dwelt in the upper air. The great high place of sacrifice on Jabal Madba has at its center 2 altars cut into the bedrock, a large one for the main sacrifice and a smaller one beside it, with channels cut to drain away the blood of the sacrificed animal and a cistern to hold the purification water. The whole arrangement is businesslike and practical, as ancient sacrificial altars always are. The sacred is handled here with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that the Nabataeans brought to everything else. The sacrifice is made, the blood flows into the channel, the smoke rises, the god is fed, transaction completed. Around the high places, carved into the accessible rock faces, are hundreds of votive inscriptions and graffiti, the names of visitors, short prayers, thank offerings for prayers answered. So-and-so, son of so-and-so, of such and such tribe, remembered before Dushara. The exact formula recurs again and again, the specific words of the Nabataean devotional language. To be remembered before the god is the aim of the offering, the hope of the worshipper, not to be transported, not to achieve union with the divine, but simply to be known, to be seen, to have one's name held in the divine presence. It is a modest and deeply human aspiration, and the Nabataeans expressed it in the simplest possible way, by scratching their names into the rock near the altars of their gods. The Nabataean religion was not exclusive. It did not demand that its adherents reject other gods, did not claim the universal truth that would make all other religions false. It was the religion of a trading people, in a world of many peoples and many gods, and it made room for the gods of the merchants who came to Petra from Egypt, and from Greece, and from Arabia, and from the East, building altars to their own divinities in the shadow of the great Nabataean temple. The religious landscape of Petra, as its inscriptions reveal, was pluralistic in a way that reflects the pluralism of the commercial city: many gods, many languages, many peoples, the whole connected world of the ancient trade routes present in the sacred topography of the Rose-Red Valley. And yet the Nabataean gods were their own. Dushara was not Zeus, however much the Hellenizing court might associate them. Al-Uzza was not entirely Aphrodite or Isis, however much she borrowed their iconography. The sacred stone was not the cult statue, however much the stone might be dressed in Greek temple architecture. At the heart of the Nabataean sacred world, beneath all the Hellenistic overlay and the cosmopolitan accommodation, there was the desert, the specific desert of the Shara Mountains and the Petra Valley, the god of that specific place, the divine presence in that specific stone. This remained theirs, particular and untranslatable, the religious identity of a people who had come from the desert, and built in the desert, and carried the desert's specific relationship to the divine with them into every phase of their civilization. The story of Petra's decline is a slow story, and slow stories are hard to tell because they lack the dramatic moment of catastrophe that makes narrative easy. There is no date we can point to and say, here is when Petra ended, here is when the desert kingdom became a ruin. The ending was a process, spread over several centuries, driven by the changing geography of trade, rather than by any single military defeat or natural disaster. The Roman annexation of 106 CE was, as we have noted, apparently peaceful. Cornelius Palma's arrival in the province of Arabia Petraea, Arabia of the Rock, did not produce a bloodbath. The Nabataean elite became Roman citizens, their city became a Roman provincial capital, their roads were incorporated into the Roman highway network. The great road called the Via Nova Traiana was built from Aqaba northward, through Petra, and up to Bostra, and onward to Syria, a proper Roman road, paved and maintained and marked with milestones, integrating the Nabataean heartland into the imperial communications network. Bostra, in the north, became the new provincial capital and the headquarters of the Legio III Cyrenaica, the Roman legion stationed in the province. A great theatre was built at Bostra, a city of Roman grandeur, rose in the Hauran. Petra continued as a city of significance, Roman in its new monuments, but Nabataean in its bones, through the 2nd and into the 3rd century CE. Visitors came, Roman officials and merchants and tourists, some of whom left their names and comments in graffiti on the Petra facades. The temples continued in use, adapted to Roman religious conventions. The water systems were maintained. The city lived, but it lived with decreasing intensity. The overland incense trade, the trade that had built Petra, was gradually losing importance to the maritime routes through the Red Sea. The Roman state, controlling both the land and the sea routes now, preferred the maritime option, which was faster and cheaper. The great caravan trade through the Hejaz and the Negev did not stop overnight, but it diminished year by year, decade by decade, as the ships took more of the business. And Petra, built on the caravan trade, found its reason for being slowly hollowing out. The earthquake of 363 CE was a physical blow to add to the commercial decline. A major seismic event, felt across the whole region, damaged or destroyed many of the structures of Petra. The built buildings were more vulnerable than the carved rock, and much of the city's constructed fabric was shaken down in this event. The rebuilding was partial. The resources to rebuild fully were no longer available. The Byzantine period left Christian monuments in Petra. A large church was built in the central area, and as I mentioned, the great urn tomb was converted into a church in 446 CE. But the Christian Petra of the Byzantine period was a much smaller, much quieter place than the Nabataean city of 5 centuries before. The Arab conquest of the 7th century swept through the region. The church of Petra was abandoned. The city, already very small by now, contracted further. The Bedouin who had always lived in the surrounding desert moved more fully into the valley, using the carved chambers as shelter. The great cisterns filled with silt. The channels became choked. The water engineering that had kept the valley alive fell into disrepair, and slowly, over the following centuries, the memory of what Petra had been faded from the wider world, surviving only in the landscape of rock and in the oral traditions of the Bedouin families who lived among the ruins. There is something beautiful, in a melancholy way, about this slow fading. Petra was not sacked, not burned, not deliberately destroyed. It was simply left behind as commerce moved on to other routes and other centers. The rose-red cliffs were there before the Nabataeans arrived, and they were there after the Nabataeans departed, indifferent to both the presence and the absence of the people who had carved their faces. The desert does not grieve for the empires that rise and fall in its embrace, and the carved facades were there, sealed, in a sense, by the very obscurity that covered the city, because no one was coming to plunder or to reuse the stone, because no medieval quarryman needed building material, because no subsequent civilization found it worthwhile to build here in the abandoned valley. The tombs and temples carved into the living rock were left exactly as they were. The paint that once colored some of them faded in the desert light. Sand drifted into the doorways. The threshold stones wore smooth under the feet of Bedouin going in and out, but the carved stone endured, the way stone always endures. And when Burckhardt came through the sick in 1812, he found the facades still there, still recognizable, still blazing in the morning light exactly as they had blazed 2,000 years before. This is the gift of obscurity. And the Nabataeans, who understood so much about the value of things that others overlooked, might have appreciated it. The full story of the Nabataean legacy cannot be told without acknowledging the people who kept Petra through the long centuries of its obscurity, the Badul Bedouin, a tribe who lived in and around the Petra Valley from at least the medieval period, and who were, until the late 20th century, the actual inhabitants of the carved city, sheltering in the ancient rock-cut chambers, and tending their flocks in the valley, and guarding the valley against outsiders, with a fierce territorial protectiveness. The Badul, whose name may derive from an Arabic root meaning substitution or exchange, suggesting perhaps a role as intermediaries or traders, were the guardians of a place they understood to be old and powerful, and charged with the presence of the ancient dead. Their legends about Petra were not the legends of scholarship. They did not know, in the 19th century, that they lived among the ruins of a Nabataean trading capital, did not know the names of Aretas and Dushara and the incense roots. Their Petra was a place of pharaohs and jinns and hidden treasure, a landscape alive with supernatural power. Its carved chambers the homes of the dead, and perhaps also of beings that were not quite dead and not quite alive. When Burckhardt entered the valley in 1812, he needed Bedouin guides, and the Badul who guided him were protective of their secret valley in ways that he had to maneuver around carefully. This protective instinct was not mere territorial possessiveness. It was the custodianship of a place that was, in the Badul understanding, sacred and dangerous, and theirs, the landscape that their families had inhabited for as long as any living memory reached. The modern story of the Badul is a difficult one. As Petra became internationally famous, and then a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and then one of the most visited tourist destinations in the world, the relationship between the Badul and their valley became contested. In the 1980s, the Jordanian government relocated the Badul from their homes in the Petra caves to a new village, Sayhon, on the plateau above the valley, as part of the development of the Petra Archaeological Park. The relocation was not without controversy. The Badul had not chosen to leave, and their connection to the valley ran deep, and the consequences for the community were mixed. Some Badul found economic opportunities in the tourist economy of Petra. Others felt the disruption of their traditional way of life acutely. The community's relationship to its ancestral valley is still negotiated and contested today. Their story is, in its own way, a continuation of the Nabataean story, a people of the desert, finding their way in a world that does not quite understand what the desert means to those who live in it, maintaining their connection to a landscape that the outside world sees as an archaeological site, but that they experience as home. The roses do not die when Petra becomes a tourist attraction. The rock does not change when the visitor buses arrive. The sick is still the sick. The Treasury still blazes in the morning light. But the Badul knew this place before the visitors came, and their knowledge of it, the specific knowledge of people who have lived in a place through all weathers and all seasons for generations, is a knowledge that no amount of archaeological scholarship quite replaces. Let me take you somewhere, now, in the last part of the night. Imagine you are on the road, not the sick, not the great facade of the Treasury, not the monumental center of the city. You are on the road between cities, the incense road itself, somewhere in the middle of the long stretch between Hegra and Petra, out in the open desert, in the night. The caravan has stopped for the night. The camels are kneeling in their lines, making the soft grumbling sounds that camels make in their sleep, a sound halfway between a purr and a moan, rhythmic and low, oddly comforting in the enormous silence of the desert night. The fires are small. They always keep the fires small on the road, not wanting to advertise the caravan's position to anyone who might be watching from the dark ridges. Enough fire to cook by, no more. The men are sleeping, most of them. A few are awake, the night guards, sitting at the perimeter with their hands on their weapons, watching the dark. Their faces are lit from below by the small coals of the fire they have nursed down to almost nothing. And above all of this, above the sleeping camels and the small fires and the watchful guards and the loads of frankincense that are the whole reason for this enormous laborious journey, above all of it, the sky. The desert sky at night is one of the great experiences available to any human being anywhere on Earth, and it is becoming, in our electrified world, increasingly rare. The Milky Way, the great band of the galaxy, containing hundreds of billions of stars, is visible to the naked eye in the desert night as a luminous cloud, a river of light stretching from horizon to horizon, so bright that it casts a faint shadow, so dense that the individual stars within it are too numerous to distinguish. Around it, on either side, the stars that can be distinguished are not the handful visible from a city or a suburb, but thousands, every star in the sky whose magnitude is above the visual limit, all of them present, all of them blazing, the whole wheel of the ancient sky in its full glory, the sky that no one in the developed world has seen for a century. The Nabataean caravan masters navigated by this sky. They knew the stars the way we know road signs, not as objects of wonder, but as practical tools, the navigational markers that told them where they were and which way to go in the trackless dark. The North Star, Polaris, was a fixed reference. The rising and setting points of the planets and the bright stars gave direction across the flat desert where there were no landmarks. The moon's position in its cycle told them the date and the tides and the expected temperatures. The sky was a map, and the sky was also, for the Nabataeans as for all ancient peoples, a religious text, a place where the gods moved and made themselves visible. The planets, the 5 visible planets that move against the background of the fixed stars, were divine beings. Venus was Alusa, the morning and evening star, the fierce and beautiful goddess who was the patron of the city and the guardian of travelers. Jupiter was Dushara in some associations. The moon, traversing its monthly cycle, measured the religious calendar. The stars in their annual return marked the seasons and the festivals. The sky and the religion and the navigation and the calendar were one continuous system, and the people who read it best were the ones who spent the most time under it. The caravan masters, the desert travelers, the people who moved through the open places where the sky was everything. On the road at night, 2,000 years ago, a Nabataean caravan master lying on his blanket looking up at the stars was seeing the same sky we see when we are far enough from our electric lights to see it. The stars have not moved perceptibly in 2,000 years. The constellations he knew are the constellations we know, the same patterns, the same relative positions, unchanged. And Venus, if it was in the sky that night, blazed as Alusa, the mighty one, the morning star, the goddess of his city and his road. This is one of the moments when the distance between us and the ancient world closes, when we look up at the same sky they looked up at, and feel, briefly, the same smallness and the same vastness and the same comfort of the familiar light in the dark, and understand what it meant to navigate by stars, to worship in the stars, to find in the great wheeling sky both a map and a god. You are here, now, in your bed, or your couch, or wherever you have settled for this night. The sky outside your window, or above the building you are in, or across the city, somewhere beyond the light, is the same sky, the same stars. Alusa rising or setting, brilliant and indifferent, the Milky Way arching overhead, whether you can see it or not, the fixed North Star that the caravan masters trusted. The desert is still out there, the rock is still there, the sick is still there, and at the end of it, in the morning, the Treasury will blaze as it has always blazed. You can rest now. You have come a long way tonight, from the nameless nomads of the 4th century before the Common Era, through the flowering of the desert kingdom, through the carved facades and the water systems and the trading caravans and the great queens and kings, through the absorption and the slow decline and the long centuries of forgetting, to the morning in 1812 when Burckhardt turned the corner and the rose-red city came blazing back into the world. You have carried the story this far. You can put it down now. The stars will still be there when you wake. The rock will still be red. The incense roots are silent now, but they ran for 1,000 years through the desert between the mountains and the sea, and their memory is in the rock, and in the script, and in the carved facades, and in the water channels still cut into the Petra sandstone after 2,000 years of silence and occasional rain, Let the night do its work. We have come to the end together. You and I, and the Nabataeans and the rose-red city that they built and left behind. If you are still awake in the small hours, if the story has not yet carried you to sleep, leave a comment below and tell me where you are tonight. Tell me what the air feels like. Tell me if you can see stars from where you are lying. Somewhere in the world, right now, others are drifting towards sleep on the same story, under the same sky, in the dark that is the same everywhere, and the same in every century. The desert kingdom is done. The treasury blazes. The script flows on. Sleep well. The ancient world was fed on a limited palette of ingredients by modern standards. But within that limitation there was enormous variety, and the Nabataean world, positioned as it was at the crossroads of multiple culinary traditions, had access to a remarkable range of foods and flavors that the isolated settlement in the same landscape could never have known. The foundation of the diet was the same as it was across much of the ancient Near East: grain, legumes, and the products of the date palm. Wheat and barley were the staples, ground into flour and baked into the flatbreads and leavened loaves that were the caloric foundation of every meal. Lentils and chickpeas provided the protein that meat, always expensive, could not reliably supply. And the date, the great gift of the desert, the fruit of the palm trees that lined the oases and the irrigated valleys, was the sweetness and the caloric density that made the desert survivable, dried and stored, and carried on the long caravan journeys as the ideal desert travel food, compact, nutritious, resistant to spoilage in the heat. But the caravan trade that ran through the Nabataean world brought with it a spice trade that could transform these simple ingredients into something extraordinary. The spices of India and Arabia, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cumin, coriander, fenugreek, were commodities that the Nabataeans handled in enormous quantities. And while most of what they carried went to the wealthy tables of the Mediterranean world, some of it stayed. A Nabataean merchant, who spent his life handling the spices of the East, inevitably brought some home. The cooking of Petra was certainly flavored, in the households of the prosperous, with spices that no farmer in the hill country of Judea or Egypt could have afforded. The olive tree, that great gift of the Mediterranean basin, did not thrive in the Nabataean heartland, which was too dry and too hot for it, but olive oil travelled the caravan routes in ceramic jars, and the Nabataeans of Petra imported it and used it, as the whole Mediterranean world used it, for cooking and for lighting and for the preparation of food. The alternative, locally produced, was sesame oil, extracted from the sesame plant, which is drought-tolerant and suited to the desert margins, and which had been cultivated in the ancient Near East since the Bronze Age. Sesame oil is a different flavor from olive oil, nuttier and more intense, and Nabataean cooking almost certainly used both: the imported Mediterranean olive oil for the table of the wealthy and the local sesame oil for the everyday kitchen. Wine was drunk in Petra, though the Nabataeans had originally, in the days of their desert nomadism, been noted by Greek observers for their abstemiousness. The early Nabataeans, the same Greek sources tell us, did not drink wine. But as the Nabataean kingdom Hellenized, and as Petra became a cosmopolitan city through which the wines of the Mediterranean world flowed in constant supply, the habits changed. Wine jars have been found in the archaeological record of Petra. Wine was drunk, if not universally, at least by the elite and by the many merchants and visitors from wine-drinking cultures who passed through the city. Water, the precious, managed, carefully stored water of the desert, was the universal drink, and its quality in Petra was, by ancient standards, high. The cistern system provided settled water that had passed through layers of geological filtration before it was collected. The spring water brought from Ain Musa was clean and cold. In a world where waterborne disease was a constant threat and unclean water a major cause of death, the Nabataean hydraulic system was also a public health system, providing Petra with water cleaner than that available in many Mediterranean cities that relied on rivers and open canals that were easily contaminated. The feasts of the Nabataean world, the great communal meals that accompanied religious festivals and royal celebrations, were occasions when the full range of available food was brought together. We know from archaeological evidence and from contemporary descriptions that Nabataean feasts were held in the triclinia, the banqueting chambers that are one of the distinctive features of the Petra landscape, large rock-cut rooms with benches along 3 walls, where the guests reclined in the Roman fashion, eating and drinking in the way of the Hellenistic and Roman world that the Nabataean elite had adopted. Dozens of triclinia have been identified in Petra, some of the grandest ones carved into the cliff faces beside the great tombs, suggesting that the feasts held in them were connected with the cult of the dead. the ritual meals at which the living fed alongside their ancestors, maintaining the bond between the generations that Nabataean culture considered essential. The food served at these feasts would have included the whole range of what Petra's commercial connections could provide. The flatbreads and the stews, the roasted meats, lamb and goat above all, the animals of the desert pastoral tradition, the dried fruits and the fresh vegetables when the season allowed, the imported spices and the local aromatics, the wine poured into the fine pottery cups that the Nabataean craftsmen made so thin and so beautiful, and incense burning at the altar in the corner of the triclinium, as it always burned at the Nabataean table. The gods invited to the feast as they were invited to every meal, the sacred smoke rising through the carved rock of the roof above, carrying the offering upward into whatever sky lay on the other side of the stone. The Nabataeans were not, as far as we know, great writers. We have no Nabataean epic, no Nabataean philosophical text, no Nabataean history of the kind that the Greeks and Romans wrote in profusion. The literary culture of the Nabataean world, if such a thing existed, has not survived in any substantial form, and the absence may be a reflection not of illiteracy or intellectual poverty, but of the material on which Nabataean texts were written. If they wrote on parchment or papyrus, as many people in the ancient world did, those texts are gone, dissolved in the desert humidity, or simply lost in the millennia of abandonment. Only the stone inscriptions survive, and stone inscriptions are not the natural home of literature. What the stone inscriptions give us is something else, a direct, unmediated window into the language of the Nabataean world, into the names and relationships and religious affiliations and commercial concerns of tens of thousands of individuals across 4 centuries. They are, collectively, one of the largest corpora of inscriptional evidence from any ancient Near Eastern culture. More Nabataean inscriptions survive than inscriptions in any other pre-Islamic Arabian script, and the picture they build up, cumulatively, of Nabataean society is extraordinarily detailed. The funerary inscriptions, the texts carved on or inside the tomb facades of Petra and Hegra, follow a standard formula that is itself a kind of Nabataean literature. This is the grave of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, the title which he made for himself and his descendants, in the month of month, in the year of the reign of king, and whoever alters this inscription, or sells this grave, or gives it to others, upon that one shall be the curse of Dushura, and of goddess, and of god, and they shall pay a fine of amount to the treasury of the king. This formula, with its careful naming of the deceased, its legal protection for the tomb against future violation, its invocation of divine penalty for transgressors, and its precisely dated chronological marker, is repeated with variations in hundreds of inscriptions, and in the repetition, the variations become significant. The different titles that people bore, the different gods they invoked, the different fine amounts for the violation of different tombs, reflecting, presumably, the social status of the deceased, the different family structures revealed in the lists of descendants permitted to use the tomb. From these dry legal texts, the social world of Nabataean Petra and Hegra builds up with remarkable specificity. The merchant class, the priestly families, the military men, the freed slaves who have acquired sufficient wealth to commission their own carved tombs, the women who owned property and commissioned funerary inscriptions in their own names, the interconnections between families, revealed by shared tomb rites and shared dedicatory inscriptions, the votive inscriptions, the dedications made at temples and altars and sacred niches, are shorter but equally revealing. So-and-so remembered before Dushara. The simple formula of Nabataean piety, repeated thousands of times across the rock faces of the Petra region and the caravan routes of the Hejaz and the Negev and the Sinai. These are the voices of ordinary Nabataeans, not the kings or the great merchants, but the caravan drivers and the shepherds and the minor traders, pausing on the road to scratch their names in the rock beside an altar, asking the god to remember them, to hold their name in the divine presence as they travel the dangerous routes between the desert and the sea. There is something deeply moving in these simple inscriptions, in the persistence of the human need to be remembered, to leave a mark, to say I was here. The Nabataeans who scratched their names on the rocks of the Sinai 2,000 years ago were doing exactly what modern tourists do when they carve their names on ancient monuments, to the enormous distress of archaeologists, asserting their presence, making themselves real in a place of great duration, asking the stone to remember them. The impulse is the same. The difference is that for the Nabataean caravan driver, the scratched name was a prayer, addressed not just to posterity, but to the divine, the god of the place, the presence in the rock, the sacred that was concentrated at the waypoint altar where the inscription was made. We have too some commercial inscriptions, contracts, receipts, letters scratched or written on ostraca, the potsherds that the ancient world used as the scratch paper of everyday commerce. These give us the transactional language of Nabataean business, the prices of goods, the terms of loans and partnerships, the disputes between merchants, the language in which money and obligation were discussed. It is dry reading in its raw form, but in the accumulation of its details, it is as revealing of Nabataean commercial culture as the great funerary inscriptions are of Nabataean social structure. And there is the letter tradition. Several Nabataean papyrus letters have survived, most famously, the archive of documents found at Nahal Heva in the Judean desert, including several Nabataean letters from the early 2nd century CE, written by or for a woman named Babatha, who was involved in a complex web of legal disputes over property and guardianship. The Babatha archive is one of the most remarkable documentary finds from the ancient Near East, a private individual's legal files, comprising documents in Nabataean and Aramaic and Greek, covering a period of several decades in the early 2nd century CE, giving us an intimate and detailed picture of one person's life at exactly the moment when the Nabataean kingdom was being absorbed into the Roman Empire and the Nabataean population was navigating the transition from subjects of a desert king to citizens of a Roman province. Babatha's documents are the most human thing we have from the Nabataean world. More human than the great facades, more human than the inscriptions of kings. They are the legal papers of a woman protecting her rights in a complicated world, negotiating the parallel legal systems of the Nabataean kingdom and the Roman Empire, arguing about her son's guardianship and her late husband's debts. She was, in the end, caught up in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-35 CE, the Jewish revolt against Roman rule, and she fled with her papers to the caves of the Judean desert, where she died or disappeared, and where her documents lay for 19 centuries until they were found by archaeologists in 1960. Her name is Babatha, and she was a Nabataean woman in a world of great change, and her papers tell her story more vividly than any epic could. This, too, is the Nabataean legacy. Not only the great carved city and the flowing script, but the ordinary human life recorded in the rock and the papyrus, the names of the merchants and the prayers of the caravan drivers and the legal disputes of a woman named Babatha, who wanted her son to have proper guardians and her property to be properly managed. The ancient world is full of kings and generals. It is rarer to hear the voices of ordinary people. The Nabataeans, who made commerce and the road their civilization, who left their names on the rocks of 100 caravan routes, who wrote their contracts on papyrus, and scratched their prayers on stone, give us an unusually rich and human record of what ordinary life in the ancient world actually was like. We have walked very far tonight, through the desert before the caravan routes, through the rise of the kingdom and the building of the city, through the water systems and the script and the gods and the queens and the kings, through the trade that built an empire from the transport of sacred smoke, through the annexation and the long decline and the centuries of forgetting, and the brilliant morning in 1812, when the rose-red city came back. It is late, or early, the desert hour when the temperature has dropped to its lowest, when the stars have all shifted from where they were when you lay down, when the body is deepest in its nightly repair, and the mind floats at the surface of sleep. I want to leave you with something to carry into your rest. The Nabataeans chose, of all the places in the world they might have chosen, a hidden valley in the rose-red rock. They could have built a city on the coast, where the trade came in from the sea. They could have built in the fertile lands of the north, where the rain fell reliably. They chose the desert. They chose the hidden valley, the narrow entrance gorge, the carved rock, the cisterns, the particular challenges, and the particular beauty of a place that seemed to forbid the thing they built there. Why? Partly, of course, for defense. The narrow sick was easier to hold than any open plain, and a city in a hidden valley could survive threats that a city on a road could not. Partly for commerce. The valley sat at the convergence of important routes, the crossroads where the desert travelers would come regardless of the difficulty of the approach. Partly for water. The springs near the valley, and the seasonal runoff from the surrounding mountains, made the hydraulic project possible, if demanding. But I wonder if there is something else. I wonder if the Nabataeans, coming from a desert culture in which the sacred was located in the specific, in the particular mountain, the particular stone, the particular spring, felt, when they first came to the Petra Valley, that this was a place of particular power. The rose-red rock, which changes color through the day from rose to amber, to blood-red to violet in the blue desert dusk. The sick, which filters and focuses and transforms the approach, so that you do not simply arrive but are prepared. The height of the surrounding massives, which give the valley the quality of an enclosure, a protected space, a place apart from the open desert world outside. The Nabataeans had a god whose name meant he of the Shara Mountains. His stone was in this valley. His presence was here, in the specific geology of this specific place. And when they built their city here, they were not just making a commercial decision. They were making a sacred one, choosing to live in the presence of their god, to build their houses and their tombs and their temples in the landscape that was the god's body, to be part of the specific place that was the divine. The valley was home. Not in the generic sense of any comfortable place, but in the deepest sense, the place that was theirs, that held their dead and their gods and their water and their carved faces and their story. The Nabataeans left it, eventually, when the world changed and the trade moved on and the water systems fell into disrepair and the valley grew quiet. But they left their names in the rock, and the rock kept them. They left their script in the world, and the world carried it forward. They left their facades in the stone, and the stone, being stone, did what stone does. It endured. You are going to sleep now, and the night is going to hold you, as the rock held the Nabataeans. In its dark and its quiet and its permanence, the morning will come, as it always does, and the light will find whatever is carved and whatever is real, as it always does, blazing up the face of whatever is standing after all the centuries. The rose-red city is there. It will be there when you wake. Sleep now. Let the desert quiet settle over you. The quiet that the Nabataean caravan masters knew. The vast, bowl-shaped, star-canopied quiet of the desert night, in which the whole weight of the sky presses down gently, and the temperature drops, and the body stills, and the mind lets go of the day and the week and the year and the whole accumulated freight of the ordinary world. You are on the road. The caravan has stopped for the night. The camels are sleeping. The fires are small and low. The guards are watching. And above you, above all of it, the full wheel of the ancient sky is turning, the Milky Way arching from horizon to horizon, Al-Uza blazing on the western rim, the fixed North Star holding still while everything else turns around it. You are held. You are here. The road has brought you to this resting place, as all roads bring travelers to rest eventually. The story is told. The desert receives you. Sleep. Thank you for spending this night in the desert kingdom, in the rose-red valley, in the carved and beautiful world of the Nabataeans. If this story carried you somewhere good, if the incense roots brought you to rest, please leave a comment telling me where you are in the world tonight, and what the air feels like, and whether you can see any stars. The Nabataeans wanted to be remembered. Tonight, you remembered them. It worked, as it always works. The mark in the stone, the name in the rock, the story told in the dark, ashes of civilizations. See you in the next one. There is a question that every great civilization asks, whether it knows it or not. Not the question of conquest, who defeated whom, whose army stood longest on the field. Not even the question of beauty, what was made, how magnificent it was. The deeper question is this: what endures? What does a people leave in the world that the world could not have made without them, that carries forward past the end of the people themselves, past the ruins, past the silence? For the Nabataeans, the answer is particular and strange and worth dwelling on in the last minutes before sleep. They left the alphabet, not as an artifact in a museum, but as a living system, in daily use, written and read by hundreds of millions of people in every country where Arabic is a mother tongue or a religious language. The Quran was compiled in Arabic script that descends directly from Nabataean cursive, the poetry of the Abbasid Golden Age, some of the greatest literature in human history, was written in a script whose shapes trace back to the commercial documents of desert merchants moving frankincense toward the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, the architectural inscriptions of the great mosques, the illuminated manuscripts of the Persian and Ottoman traditions, the newspapers and novels and text messages written in Arabic script today in Cairo and Baghdad and Amman and Casablanca and Jakarta. All of them are writing in a system that the Nabataeans developed, that emerged from the specific needs of the specific commercial culture of a desert kingdom that lasted 500 years and then passed. The Nabataean scribes did not know this was coming. They could not have imagined it. They developed their cursive script for the same reasons scribes everywhere developed cursive scripts, because writing faster is more efficient, because connected letters require fewer pen lifts, because the demands of a commercial economy require a writing system that can keep pace with the transactions it records. They were solving a practical problem. The solution they reached turned out to be one of the most consequential acts in the history of written communication. The practical becomes the profound, as it so often does, when the practical is done very, very well. They left water knowledge, the Nabataean understanding of how to capture and store and distribute water in an arid landscape, the cisterns, the channels, the check dams, the understanding of runoff and infiltration and evaporation in a desert environment, is knowledge that the people of this region carried forward through the centuries of abandonment and change, embedded in the agricultural and pastoral practices of the people who continued to live in the Negev and the Hejaz after the Nabataean kingdom was gone. The Byzantine farmers who took over the Nabataean agricultural terraces of the Negev used the Nabataean water systems. The Bedouin who lived in the Petra valley used the Nabataean cisterns. The modern hydrologists who study the Nabataean systems for lessons applicable to contemporary water management in the Middle East and other arid regions are recovering knowledge that the Nabataeans had and deployed with extraordinary effectiveness. They left the routes, the caravan routes that the Nabataeans identified, maintained, and made safe, marking the water sources, building the caravanserais, negotiating the access agreements with the tribal leaders along the way, became the permanent geography of movement through the region. The Islamic pilgrimage route from Syria to Mecca, the Darb al-Hajj, follows in significant part the same corridors through the Hejaz that the Nabataean incense caravans travelled. The modern roads and the ancient tracks are sometimes literally the same route, the path of least resistance through difficult terrain identified once and used ever after. The Nabataeans walked these roads into permanence, and they left Petra, still there, still red, still blazing in the morning light when the sun clears the Kubtha Massif and finds the Treasury facade and the carving blazes rose and amber and cream, the geological colours of the sandstone brought alive by the light that has been finding them every morning for 2,000 years and more. Petra is the most durable of the Nabataean legacies because it is the most physically present. You can go there, you can walk the sick and turn the corner. The experience is available, the specific, overwhelming, particular experience of arriving at the Treasury after the gorge, the way the approach and the reveal work together to make something that no amount of description or photography quite prepares you for, because the theatrical effect depends on the duration of the sick and the suddenness of the opening, on the physical experience of the narrow canyon releasing into the view of the facade. And that physical experience requires being physically there. The Nabataeans built something you have to go to, something that cannot be transported or reproduced or adequately represented, something that requires the presence of the person in the specific place, requires you to walk the road, enter the gorge, feel the walls close around you, and then open. This is the final Nabataean gift, the experience of arrival. They built a place designed to be approached, and the approach transforms the arrival, and the arrival transforms the person who arrives. Every morning, the light finds the Treasury. Every morning, someone turns the corner and sees it. Every morning, the rose-red city comes back into the world. You can go there. The road is still open. The sick is still navigable. The facade is still blazing. And tonight, in your imagination, you have already been. You have walked the gorge in the dark of a long night's story, and you have turned the corner, and the Treasury has blazed for you in the morning light of 500 years of a desert civilization's full, extraordinary, ordinary life. You carry it now. The story is in you, as all stories are in the people who hear them, deposited in the memory alongside everything else we carry through our days. The Nabataeans wanted to be remembered. They scratched their names in rock and carved their faces in cliffs and pressed their script into the soft clay of their world and hoped the marks would last. Tonight the marks have reached you. Rest now, in the desert quiet, under the ancient sky, in the warmth of the rock that has stored the day's heat and releases it slowly into the cooling night. The camels are sleeping, the fires are low, the stars are out in their full ancient numbers, the whole burning wheel of the sky turning slowly around the fixed North Star. The valley of Petra is there, in the dark, on the other side of the world from where you are lying. The Treasury is there, waiting for the morning light. The sick is there, quiet and cool and smelling of old stone, and you are here, going to sleep on a story 2,000 years old and still alive. It worked. It always works. Sleep,